All right, so welcome everyone. On behalf of the Engineering Change Lab USA Steering Committee and Board of Directors, welcome and thank you for taking part in our 12th summit. For those of you who are interested, our first summit was held in Omaha in July of 2017. So as we approach our 4th anniversary, thanks to all of you for taking part in our work. And I want to extend a special welcome to those of you who are taking part in your first summit, including 10 people on the call today who were part of our focus groups that we will talk to you about later in the summit. And welcome also to our provocateurs. Hopefully all of you have received my email from earlier today, which contains important information regarding the summit. Basically, it's reach out to me if you're running into any kind of problems. So in 2019, Engineering Change Lab received a grant from NCEES that allowed us to go into operation. And in 2020, NCEES awarded a second grant to us, and we are extremely grateful for their support. Thank you also to the companies that are listed on this slide, who have also all stepped up to provide additional financial support. And in addition to their financial support, these companies represent the core stakeholders that make our work possible. This is our Engineering Change Lab USA Steering Committee. Most of these folks are on the call today and are available to answer any questions or listen to ideas about how we can enhance or expand our work, and we are truly open to that input. As a reminder, remember that the vision for Engineering Change Lab USA begins with the technological and environmental challenges of the future and the imperative for the engineering community to increase its contributions to addressing these challenges. From these come our mission to be a catalyst for change within the engineering community, helping it reach its highest potential on behalf of society. An important aspect of our summits is challenging the status quo and provoking new ways of thinking about the future of engineering. To better define what this means, we have developed a provocateur's principles statement that you all received and that is summarized on this slide. We ask that everyone approach today's discussions with an openness to learning and to contributing to the discussion in a respectful manner. And with that, I would like to introduce Kyle Davey, our Engineering Change Lab Creative Director and Lead Facilitator. So Kyle, it's all yours to get us going for the day.
All right, thanks, Mike. And I'm going to, if you can pull your slides, I'm going to go ahead and share mine desktop. So just a note about this particular summit. In general, the Change Lab has really been set up to look at the entire breadth of the engineering community in the US. But for this particular summit, we made a choice to focus on one particular segment of that broad community. And that's the segment that we're calling the engineering companies, but you could think of them as the equivalent of the consulting engineering firms, and look at the future from that perspective. And lots of different choices in terms of different aspects of the future we could have examined or explored as part of that deep dive into that segment of our community. But we decided that there would be two particular aspects of that future that we wanted to look at. One was the external landscape that these firms would be facing in the future. And to examine that landscape within the context of the types of risks and the changes that are happening with regard to technology, and also the changes that are happening with regard to nature, and what those risks and changes begin to imply with regard to how they will affect first the clients of these consulting engineering firms, but then in turn, how consulting engineering firms or engineering companies are going to have to or can take advantage of opportunities that will be created as those clients begin to adapt to, respond to the types of risks that are on the horizons for those firms. So that'll be the first segment of our work today. The second segment, we decided that we wanted to focus really on the workforce side of the future of these engineering companies, and what we're calling the talent cohorts that will be moving through their careers over the foreseeable future inside these firms, recognizing there will be the people that are in the 1 to 3 year category versus 5 to 10 or 20 to 25, or the real seniors. They're going to move through and will bring different values, aspirations, mindsets to bear with regard to what they want to do, what type of experience they want with the firms that they're part of, and there'll be an interplay between the firms and those that talent moving through those organizations. And we wanted to examine that particularly from a lens that looks at values. So that will be the second half. Is
You're muted, Kyle.
Well, that was a nice introduction that none of you heard. So let me try it again.
Kyle, we heard up until about 30 seconds ago.
Oh, really? So
Yeah.
something kicked off. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, with that introduction, then just let me talk about the agenda related to those two halves. So the first half is on those global risks, technological accelerators, changes with regard to nature. The second half examining the talent cohorts of the workforce of the future through that lens of values, mindsets, and aspirations. So as similar to most of the summits that we bring forward with regard to the Change Lab, what we'll start with is a set of provocateurs, and then follow those provocateurs with an opportunity for the participants to explore the ideas presented by the provocateurs and the particular question that we're examining in group exercises. So we'll start with 3 provocateurs, and I'll introduce them each as we move to their segments. So, but there'll be 3 provocateurs talking about that external landscape. We'll do an exercise that examines, those forces and how first clients and then firms might respond. We'll have 2 bridge provocateurs that will speak to particular mindsets that we think are emerging that will be important for engineering companies to begin to take a stance with regard to, and those, they serve as a bridge in the sense that those mindsets create opportunities, we believe, in terms of how firms might craft new value propositions or new business models in response to changes. But they also speak to emerging value sets that may be present in the workforce. So when we come to the value side of things and looking at the talent cohorts or workforce, we'll have 2 pieces of research that we want to present out to set up our the exploration in groups. The first is a set of focus groups that Mike and I conducted that were to give a sort of an overview of what types of values might be present in firms in these different age cohorts. The second will be a much more in-depth look at 3 particular emerging values within firms. Values around social justice, environmental protection, and diversity, inclusion, and equity inside firms. And that will be presented by Darshan Karwat and the team that he's put together at Arizona State in terms of a web-based value survey of engineering companies that really serves both to inform our work, but as a pilot for future work examining these types of values, not only inside engineering companies or consulting engineering firms, but hopefully that pilot will lead to looking at similar questions in the entire engineering community. So that'll be the agenda that we're following. A couple just notes about ground rules and or logistics in particular. We'll use the chat function in this session. And, in past sessions, that's been quite a rich repository of not only commentary about the session, but the resources that are available to people. So pay attention to the chat. Mike will publish that shortly after the session concludes so that you'll have a copy of all those resources or notes that people shared. We'll be, as we said in our communication leading up to the session, we'll be using sort of a dual screen approach where we'll have the Zoom screen open for seeing each other and or shared PowerPoints, but we'll also ask people to hold open the Google Doc workbook, which serves as, I would characterize it as our shared flip chart and resource for guiding the exploration and the conversation that we use. It'll be particularly important when we move into breakout groups. There will be the instructions in terms of what we're asking people to do in those breakout groups, as well as prompts and questions for doing that. And for each of the groups, you'll have your own section of that Google Doc where a recorder can take your notes that can guide and aid your discussion, but also be a basis of a report out in terms of some of the key findings that you came upon in your conversation. But it also is a rich source for Mike, who takes the lead in this, and myself and others who help put together a summary report coming out of this session. So just a couple of notes about those. We will have about a 20-minute break in the middle of the program for people to run out, grab something for lunch, but mostly our approach is to do this as a bit of a lunch and learn. So grab your lunch, bring it back. So it's only 20 minutes, not a longer lunch break in terms of being able to go out and actually have an extended period for grabbing your bite to eat. So with that introduction, what I'd like to do is move into this first half of our work, which is on this, idea, what are the forces of change within the context of global risks, technology accelerators, and major things going on with regard to Mother Nature? And what does that imply about how clients might respond? And then ultimately, an examination of potential new value propositions, new models of practice or business that engineering companies could consider as a way of creating value for clients responding to those changes and risks. So the first of the provocateurs that we want to offer you this morning is Stephen Brockwell. And Stephen is with Esri. He is the product owner for AEC integration with Esri. In particular, he works in the integration of GIS and BIM with regard to their offerings, the work they do with consulting engineering and other types of design and construction firms in the AEC industry. So he's up in Ottawa. Pleased to have him come down by Zoom and joining us this morning. And so Stephen, if I can turn it over to you then.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Kyle. All right. Share my screen, share sound. Yep, we're all good this time. Okay. Welcome, everybody. I participated in one of these, a couple of years ago, and I was really thrilled to be both part of the, provocateur process, but also participate. And I learned a lot. It's incredible information for us as a software engineering firm to be able to, learn directly like this from you. So I really thank you very much for having me. And I hope you enjoy what I'm going to sort of provoke you about with regards to primarily artificial intelligence. I'm not going to talk too much about what Esri is doing right now. It's kind of very specific to, customer workflows. I'm going to talk much more about the future and a lot of the work that Autodesk has done, which is a big partner of ours, of course. It's a part of our work. So I'm going to get going on that. So First of all, there's a few terms here that are important to distinguish between, and that's machine learning, which is essentially part of the engine of how artificial intelligence works, but it isn't the artificial intelligence itself. And you see a lot of that in, it's in the survey side with LiDAR scanning and that kind of thing, learning how to recognize, training, the software engines, to be able to identify patterns and those kinds of things. That's sort of like, in a sense, at a sort of platform level of what is necessary for machine learning and artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence takes the learned information, algorithms, predictive and stochastic techniques to generate alternatives, to make inferences, and to find patterns of things. And as we'll see, many of these are already have been in production for many years. Just a quick side note, I mean, the history of artificial intelligence is very old. It goes back to the 60s, when it was sort of conceived of, when computing was insufficient to really make it a reality. Now, computing is ubiquitous as a service, and it's making the artificial intelligence a kind of mainstream technology. On top of those two principles, a lot of engineering firms and a lot of software firms are providing what we call generative design, which is a way of formulating problem domains and allowing massive computation and careful analysis to triage and create alternative designs that in some cases, as we'll see, would never really have been able to have, been designed, or probably would not have been designed by a human, but have optimal properties that are really something you would never be able to get with traditional engineering techniques. So these are all examples of how things are happening today. On the civil side, survey engineering, particularly on the scanning side, we use it to plan routes and to extract information from LiDAR and photogrammetric scans. Photogrammetry is, of course, for the most part, entirely computational and not an example of machine learning or artificial intelligence. It's what happens with the result that starts to leverage that kind of technology, the data extraction and feature extraction. And Esri has partners, one of which is Cyclomedia. It's a company from the Netherlands with a large US presence, where they are working with customers consultatively to define what they want to extract, teaching the system how to recognize those things, and then literally taking data collection tasks that would have cost hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in the past at massive scales, and delivering from scan to feature data in a matter of a month or two, which is unprecedented velocity that would not be possible without these techniques. On the mechanical side, I'm going to show you a few examples that are just astonishing in terms of changes to the way manufacturing happens, the way design happens, and how these are related, and the changes that they, I think, imply on so many levels, changes to labor, changes to the kind of whole engineering practice of how do you know that the design is correct? How do you certify a design that was completely generated by a machine with an engineer guiding the parameters of it? These are really important questions, I think. But even on the chemical engineering side, both from a process point of view, which is very common and related to analytics, real-time analytics, and then inference from that data, changing the way production processes work and optimizing those. But also in the fundamentals of being able to visualize and model complex molecular structures. It's growing, very rapidly growing aspect of this. And in fact, simulation has been a key part of some of the COVID vaccine development and acceleration, where without machine learning and massive computation, some of the alternatives would not have been as, found as quickly as they were. When you think about the normal development time of vaccines, we're talking years in general terms. Many of the candidates that were, brought forward for trials were developed fundamentally in months based on, profound understandings of these, the structures of these entities that would not have really been possible without some of the machine learning underpinnings for the visualization and the ability to triage alternatives much more quickly than you would be able to do otherwise. Now, another part that I want to really make clear is that a lot of these services are becoming commodified and available to everyone. So this includes your competitors, your customers, and this is an interesting problem in the industry. But what's happening now is you have these sort of generative design services. There's some examples here from Autodesk, and I'll point at a few because it's really quite interesting. This is an example of a strut, and there's a sort of basic design of a strut here, and the task was to, okay, well, given sort of parameters of strength and support and mobility and fit into a sort of existing context, what can I remove from this to maintain the strength but minimize the material used to create the entity? And that is becoming really fascinating because you're getting these beautiful designs, but minimizing the amount of material that's required to make them, which I think has longer term and bigger implications as well when it's done at scale. Shoes, this is sort of machine learning generated shoe lattice that is sort of optimized for springiness and material. This is a skull replacement, sort of material generated, printed, 3D printed replacement for, a massive surgery, as you can see. So the ability to create things that solve problems that, would take an engineering team weeks, months, years potentially. Many of these problems can be broken down into, framing exercises that allow computation and these machine learning and artificial intelligence techniques to fill in that intense computational role. This is an example of a bridge. This is sort of like the pre-design side of it. It's a company called MX3D in the Netherlands. And there are examples where they have built it. It's a self-building bridge. And that is part of the design parameters where, it's the robots actually build the bridge in place. So it is not moved. This is one of the most important changes, I think. It's the manufacture happens in place with materials that are 3D printed, that dry or are forged, welded, very rapidly. But that's a huge change to the way people think about how to construct something. So, the possibilities of this are, and there's the Mars facility in Toronto where the Autodesk Labs and Autodesk research team works. They've done some incredible generative design work to create office space that is optimized for everybody. This is a really fascinating project. That's what was happening here. So you get to choose a number of parameters, some of which are very, this amount of space. I'd like, this amount of light, those kinds of things. But then I'd like this amount of traffic. I'm a social person. I'd like to be, in the traffic zone where I get to say hello to people all the time. Or I'm a really quiet person. I need to be relatively isolated. Those are sort of more social parameters that they put into this. And through iterative design, they designed an office space that is really fantastic to see because it's not rectangular in many cases. Like the layout is very organic and it has a beautiful flow to it that was generated from both, kind of mathematically easily defined parameters and more fuzzy social parameters. And then the other idea here is making, designs that might have been impossible possible. So, structures and materials even, and putting that whole thing together with a manufacturing process where machine learning and AI is part of the entire life cycle, really. I'm going to give you a little bit of a video here of the Autodesk kind of vision for generative design, because I think it's really important to share that with you. So I'm just going to be quiet for a moment.
Generative design can be about much more than simply turning out alternatives. Prototypes can be scanned and equipped with sensors that provide real-time performance data that can be looped back into the design process.
Just want to say one thing. That's what I mean about that whole ecosystem lifecycle thing, right? It's not just that machine learning and generative design are, okay, you get a design, you build it, and then you send it out there. You don't have enough information necessarily to get that design optimized over the long term. So the machine is self-optimizing because it monitors its performance in the field as it's operating. That's an incredible, incredible change.
So the object, in effect, co-designs itself. And depending on the material and method of manufacture chosen, the software can optimize the design for those choices. In its search for the optimal design, generative design creates complex forms that would otherwise be impossible to make using traditional manufacturing methods. Now, with advancements in material science and the ability of 3D printers to print metal, companies like Airbus can create forms like this airplane partition panel that's half as light and just as strong. The result? Significant reduction in fuel costs and CO2 emissions. The things that have limited us in the past, software, materials, manufacturing, no longer do so. With generative design, the world can look and perform any way we want it to. This is the next stage in the evolution of design, and it's happening now.
So yeah, that is now a commercially available product in the Autodesk Cloud, which is, I find that absolutely fascinating. For Autodesk Fusion, if you're a subscriber to that, you can use these tools and get started on the journey of this process right now, today. Whoops, go to the next one. Okay, this is another example, which is a lot of fun, of course, but this is the Zinger car, which is a supercar. The price, I'm not sure what it's going to be. It is not quite ready yet, but it is being manufactured as we speak. And there's some important things here that, we'll get to after you see the video for this one, which I think is also very valuable. Oh, that's interesting. It's not showing, giving you the audio. But essentially, I want to get to a couple of spots here. I'm not sure why the audio is not playing on this one. But right here, that is where the machine parts are being manufactured. So the assembly of the machine we'll see in a second, of the car itself, but the parts are being manufactured with metal 3D printers at scale, moderate scale. Of course, it's a supercar, it's not a Honda Civic, but it is being built at scale. And the thing is, they have price parity versus cast aluminum now. So that is really something. What does that mean? It means that the mold doesn't exist, right? So the time between making a change to optimize the design and generating that part, and of course, if physically speaking, the interfaces where the part fits are identical, but the interior of the part where it's being made lighter or stronger changes, you can literally just in time make changes to the component as it's being built and shipped and manufactured. So now there are huge implications to what that means from a quality, safety, and other point of view. And that's, I think, one of the huge challenges in this entire topic. But as you'll see in a moment, it goes further into this, which is the, again, on-site, in-spot manufacturing process. So this entire vehicle is constructed as these parts come out of the 3D printed assemblies with robots that build it entirely from scratch in place. So if you want to upscale your manufacturing, you just get more space and put in more of these robot crews that work again in place with these parts as they're coming out of the foundry, which is really a set of 3D printers. Goodbye, Henry Ford, to a certain extent, because no longer do we have this kind of manufacturing life cycle where a single human being sits in a spot and does one thing, rivets, bolts, this kind of thing. It's a completely automated process in a single space. So that the car comes out of that space from there. It doesn't go through a manufacturing belt or anything like that. All right.
Hey, Stephen, just as a timing heads up, you've got about 3 or 4 minutes.
I'm fine. I'm almost done. Yeah. So what does this mean for engineering firms? Here's sort of the value chain for the machine learning, artificial intelligence, and generative design sort of platform. So this is now something that is available from multiple vendors. There's intense competition. You'll see a lot of interesting articles on this notion of a multi-cloud, like get your machine learning from Google, get your, sort of core computational services from Azure, use Amazon for storage. These are, like this interoperability and choice is part of the platform. These are all commodity entities now in the computing cloud infrastructure. So, and this includes the modeling services. So Autodesk Fusion, of course, has an API. You don't have to use it as an end user. You can do it like as an API that you wrap your branded service around. That's important because you can use this in a variety of ways. I'm hoping you can see the users here. I'm obscured a little bit by the my little window, but
We can see the whole slide, Stephen.
okay, great. So you have, your engineers who are using services of this nature, perhaps behind your firewall on your, in your own kind of environment. But do your customers use this too? And does this kind of, how does this kind of environment position you for changes to the way you're going to run your business in the future? Your customers, and this is what happens when technology gets rapidly adopted, right? They have both, aspirational but unrealistic expectations of what's going to happen. So this creates enormous problems, as we'll see. So what does this mean for the engineering practices that you're all using? I mean, this is in many cases and will be the case for, the immediate future for many organizations and a lot of, into the long-term future. However, it's going to change profitability and other competitiveness issues, I think. But right now, a team of engineers works with contractors and the customer to design and build a bridge with the help of computers. So you use AutoCAD, you use Revit maybe because you're more sophisticated, and you use Dynamo, that's fantastic. But the computer is really a kind of facilitator of a human activity. The really, I think, industrial revolution aspect of this is that this is where we are moving, where a team of engineers with cloud services and intelligent machines like that, robot that constructs the bridge as it rides on it, and the automotive manufacturer in sight in a plant, just being able to kind of grow in that way. And this applies to civil engineering as well, 3D printing houses in place, not having to ship them or not having to build them in traditional ways. So this is the future, I think, for a lot of engineering firms. And what does it mean? So it doesn't eliminate the role of the engineer, it changes it. So who's going to consult with, define the problem domain, and test the results? It changes the nature of the education profile of some of your engineers, I think, but it doesn't eliminate it. And I found, as we've been interviewing people, we're desperately trying to recruit really qualified and talented engineers for our AEC practice at Esri. But a lot of them already have a lot of these skills. People are learning these, the young engineers, they find this fascinating, they see the possibilities. And how are you going to challenge them for that kind of role that they're expecting? And how will the fundamentals adapt? Like this, if I were an engineering firm owner, would really terrify me. What does my liability look like? How do I insure myself? How do I license my engineers? How do I bill for these services? What part of the platform does the customer pay for? And then what opportunities do you have to uniquely brand yourself as an expert in this area that does something different from your competitors, so that there's a reason? Do you specialize in a domain? What is your role in this ecosystem? And then finally, I think there are ethical and economic policy concerns too. What does this do for labor in manufacturing and construction, which is such an incredible driver of the fundamentals of the economy? It will change, and it's changing now, but what are the implications of that? And then if we're reducing, the sort of massive things, if we're changing, the scale, what does this present for opportunities for sustainability? That's it. That's my
All right. Well, thank you, Stephen. You know, that picture into the landscape that organizations are going to be facing, engineering companies are going to be facing in the future, and you know, recognizing that as those shifts happen, clients are going to be reacting to them, dealing with both the risk and the opportunities that come with those. That in turn begins to imply you know, different possibilities for the engineering companies that are serving those companies in that ecosystem that Stephen is describing there. So we want to turn from that, you know, little glimpse of the future with regard to the technological side of things to a glimpse of the future that looks at, you know, what's the changing landscape with regard to nature and the forces of change that are happening in nature, things like climate change, et cetera. And again, what does that imply about new ways that clients may be responding to those changes? And in turn, how design firms can plug into those dynamics in different ways, perhaps, than they have in the past. So for this, we want to turn to Martha Rogers, who is a natural capital economist with the Nature Company. And in particular is with the Nature Company's Center for Sustainable Science. She's a technical lead for a major collaboration that they have with Dow. Really doing just, I think, some incredibly interesting work with Dow in terms of how they apply principles of natural capital and rethink that in, you know, the industrial chemical processes that are represented by that company. But she's also, you know, a lead with regard to building the business case for natural infrastructure investments as a key climate adaptation strategy within the context of the Nature Company and the work that they're doing on an ongoing basis. So with that, Martha, I'd like to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I was going to introduce myself, but I don't think I have to now. That was wonderful. Here, I'll pull up the slides. Yeah, so what I'm going to walk through today is really setting out some of the ways that the Nature Conservancy as an organization has framed a lot of the environmental challenges that we're seeing are going to be faced in the next, you know, 10, 20, 30 years. And then to address that, how we're looking at, you know, trying to really drive the adoption of nature-based solutions as one avenue of addressing and mitigating some of those challenges going forward. So, you know, slightly less grim than the last presentation in the beginning, but bear with me on that. Okay. All right. So a lot of this is not going to be new to all of you. We all kind of see these headlines, and what you're seeing on this screen are really just a subset of headlines from the last year alone, right? So these environmental challenges, I think we're all aware of, but they can feel very drastic at times, right? 2020 tied for the hottest year on record. You'll remember, you know, I think it was what, 2018, I guess the Mississippi River flooding was the longest lasting and really deep. The hurricane seasons have gotten increasingly strong and devastating. Carbon dioxide levels are rising. Biodiversity is collapsing. All of this stuff we're kind of seeing in the headlines. And, you know, how that ties down, where we see it sort of quantitatively is on and mapping out sort of the two primary drivers that the Nature Conservancy has identified in these sort of challenges. One is rapid rates of biodiversity loss. So monitored populations of different various species have declined by 68% between 1970 and 2016. So quite drastic loss in biodiversity that we're seeing over the last 5 decades. And this is obviously coupled with increasing carbon emissions. So 3/4 of carbon dioxide emissions driven by humans have occurred since 1950. And humans are adding approximately 40 billion metric tons of CO2 to the atmosphere annually. So rates of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are going up quite drastically. So the challenge then, and then, you know, sort of thinking about that's what's happening. And then at the same time, we have increasing pressures that are being placed on our natural environment just by human society. So the Nature Conservancy did an exercise where we mapped out basically what the world would look like in 2050 in terms of demand, and then what that means for nature and how we get there. So we're going to have growing populations and economies going forward to 2050. Population is going to grow by estimated by 41%. GDP economies by 317%. And, you know, it's no surprise that as populations grow, there's increasing demand placed on food, water, energy, all the things that we really need to survive in this world as species. So calorie demand is going to go up 53%. Water demand, I find this one, you know, sort of very eye-opening, is estimated to increase by 234%. So how do you meet these growing needs, but do it in a way that addresses some of the biodiversity loss and climate change that we're already seeing today and is really, you know, only projected to getting worse in the future? And so what the organization did is we built out sort of two different paths looking to 2050. One, business as usual. This is similar to a lot of other studies you may have seen related to sustainability, a business as usual, and then a more sustainable path that looks at bringing in sustainable practices into business, renewable energy, all of this to try to get us on a better path for humans and the planet. And what you see here is really just the sort of improvements you get with a sustainable path, is that you can get essentially the same amount of growth, the same amount of development, but with lower increases in global temperatures, improved air quality, improved fishery health, improved land protection. So on all these sort of environmental metrics that we want to be making progress on, there are ways to do that while also obtaining the growth that we're expecting to have. So really just here is promoting this idea of a sustainable growth path looking into the next 3 decades. And so what we're trying to do is really drive this sustainable growth path globally as one of our main goals as an organization. So to do that, we have 3 main areas where we're really trying to make progress, provide food and water sustainability, tackle climate change, and protect land and water. So these are sort of the categories within which we bucket the work that we do. And for those of you that are less familiar with the Nature Conservancy, we're one of the largest environmental nonprofit conservation organizations in the world. We have about 4,000 staff that operate globally. We work in a number of different countries and sort of all major regions of the world. And we really, as an organization, pride ourselves on being a science-based organization. So we attempt to approach the work we do. You know, the exercise that I just walked through is a really good example of how we approach our work, thinking through like, what is the science saying? So it's saying we're going to have increased demand. It's saying carbon dioxide levels are rising, biodiversity is getting lost. And is there a way to slow down the sort of deterioration of a lot of the environmental services we're seeing while not reducing individuals' levels of livelihood and ability to meet their needs? And so one avenue to approach all of this work that we've identified is driving the adoption of nature-based solutions. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, because what I think it really does tie best into engineering and some of the work we're doing with companies and governments as well, in terms of thinking through the practices that they adopt and focus on. So for those of you that are not familiar with the term, nature-based solutions are really actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural and modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, while simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. So, you know, a lot of this, the terms here can be a bit confusing, I will admit, because natural infrastructure is sometimes used sort of synonymously with nature-based solutions. Green infrastructure is similar. And so what you're seeing on this slide are just examples of various nature-based solutions. And all of the ones that are on this screen can really help with flood mitigation, water storage, all of that stuff. So, you know, green roofs in cities, those can also help with urban heat, constructed wetlands, roadside trees, rain barrels. You know, mangroves are really effective at reducing storm surge and flooding during major storm events. So, you know, the idea here is really to start thinking about not just nature as a place that you go to visit, but as an asset that we can really leverage in a lot of our engineering designs to both address the challenge that we're trying to face, the engineering challenge, but also getting all of these other stacked benefits along with it, especially as we look to sort of the other environmental challenges that they can help sort of mitigate, you know, improve progress towards around biodiversity, carbon emissions. Mangroves, for example, are highly effective carbon storage ecosystems, right? So they really store and sequester a huge amount of carbon. So if you use mangroves to protect assets on the shore, you'll also be getting carbon benefits along with it. So you get a lot of these sorts of stacked benefits when you think through nature-based solutions. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through different examples of how, as an organization, Nature Conservancy has really tried to think through and promote the use of nature-based solutions, and to do that in a way that combines the science with the sort of policy and use case scenario. And the first two examples that I'm going to walk through came out of our collaboration work with Dow, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a few slides. So this first example is looking at reforestation as a novel abatement and compliance measure for ground level ozone. So this study, we focused on an area in Houston. So Houston at the time, and I think currently still, was an ozone non-attainment area. So they had to think about measures, Dow in particular, to address the non-ozone attainment. And so what TNC and Dow did for this project was we did a study about, let's consider if we used reforestation. So we reforested a big piece of land, which you can see sort of marked on the map here. It's a bit hard to see with all the other stuff going on. So here's the reforestation site. Here's Houston with the non-attainment area. So if we use reforestation, would that be a cost-effective means of addressing some of the ground level ozone measures in the area or not? Because the idea here is, like, especially when you're thinking about nature-based solutions in a business setting, you want the natural nature-based solution to be effective. So it has to do what you want it to do, but it also has to be cost-effective, right? Because a lot of companies, there's a limit to which they're going to pay above and beyond what they would for traditional measures for a nature-based solution. So there's a lot of work to be done in understanding how cost-effective these sorts of strategies can be. So what the team does is we modeled a number of different scenarios, so forest scenarios in particular, assuming different levels of ozone removal rates by the trees, so a high removal rate and a low removal rate, and then with and without carbon credits. So here's this idea of looking at some of the stacked benefits. If we could bring in additional funding around the carbon sequestration provided by the trees, the project obviously becomes more cost effective because you're adding on different avenues of sourcing funding for the project. And so on the vertical axis here, you have the dollars per ton of NOx removal, and just comparing it with high and low, the sort of bar here is representing different estimates on planting costs or costs of installation. So we have conventional NOx controls, and really what we came into the study showing is that in 3 of the 4 reforestation scenarios for ozone abatement, it was more cost effective than the conventional control. So it's possible to do these kind of nature-based solutions and to not only have them be effective at doing what you want them to do, but to also have them be cost effective. And then, unfortunately, actually this project, the sort of bummer about this project is it wasn't implemented because the Texas Department of Environmental Quality wasn't quite ready to make the step. I'll talk about this a little bit more in a bit and some of the challenges in driving the adoption of nature-based solutions. But one of the big things is a lot of times they're seen as pretty novel technology. So there can be a hesitancy with regulators to move forward in approving them because it's just not something that's been implemented a lot. But we did sort of show this. So we're continuing to try and work on identifying areas where we could do reforestation as an ozone abatement strategy. And the second project I'm going to talk about with Dow was the ash pond closure. So here, this is actually at Dow's headquarters site in Midland, Michigan. And Dow was looking at the closure of a 23-acre ash pond site at its Michigan operations. And so they wanted to figure out how they could effectively close this site. It had been built in the 1940s to support an on-site coal-fired power plant and was used as a cooling pond until around the 1980s. And so, sort of traditionally what they would have done was capped and planted it with grass. And so what we wanted to see is, was there a more cost-effective means of restoring the site that didn't necessarily just turn it into a sort of field that had to be fenced off and consistently monitored to make sure that it was up to standards. And so we worked with Dow on developing an alternative restoration scenario for this ash pond. So on the left, what you're seeing is the sort of traditional restoration that would have, sort of happened in the business as usual scenario. And on the right, you're seeing our more ecosystem-based restoration, where we brought in a number of different plant species, put some paths actually that would have been accessible to the city of Midland, some sort of water storage areas for flooding events. And we did some analyses to see, again, is this cost effective? This is always a question we're trying to ask in the work we're doing with corporate partners. And where we came out that actually over the 10 years of the project, this environmental restoration that was, sort of more alternative design to what would have traditionally been done at Dow, saved 1.8 to 2 million estimated in NPV over its 10-year life. So over the long term, it was a lot more, significantly more cost effective, despite the fact that there were lower upfront costs to get the traditional remediation done. And that's just because there was less planting, essentially, right, that had to happen in the beginning. The other thing we saw is, significantly improved ecosystem service performance. And, this is not surprising if you just look at the design, right? It looks like there's a lot more ecosystem services happening over here because there's a lot more plants, a lot more, it's more aesthetically pleasing. It's got a lot more species, biodiversity happening, but it's also actually restoring the ash pond, right? So here again is a great example of restoring the ash pond, but it's doing it in a way that's providing all of these stacked benefits. And there's been actually some enhanced stormwater control as well that Dow has seen coming off of the site, because this the river has flooded a few times since its installation, and they've noticed that it's basically able to act as a floodplain for water that's rising out of the river. And so both of these projects that I just went through are really coming out of the 10-year-long collaboration that TNC has had with Dow. And this is sort of highlighting how the work has progressed over the last 10 years with Dow. So the reforestation project that I walked through was one of our initial pilot projects that we published in 2014. And then since then, around 2015 was when Dow announced its Valuing Nature goal, which really was a product of our collaboration with Dow. And with this goal, Dow is aiming to obtain $1 billion in business value from projects that are better for nature and good for business. So the ash pond example that I just went through with you is an example of a project that is included in Dow's Valuing Nature goal and some of the work we've done on advancing that goal since 2015. And so, that's sort of been a lot of the work from 2015 to 2020. And now we're actually expanding a lot of the work we do with Dow into thinking through additional things like climate resiliency, particularly on the Gulf Coast, where Dow has a lot of expensive assets, water security, and then carbon mitigation and sequestration as well. So now sort of switching gears a little bit, I want to talk about one more example of some of these nature-based solutions that are happening at the Nature Conservancy. And this one is around coral reefs and thinking through coral reefs as a natural asset to be insured. So coral reefs protect more than 200 million people from storms globally, and they're worth about 6.8 billion a year in fisheries value. So, they're significantly valuable resources. And so the idea here was we looked at a plot of land in Quintana Roo, Mexico. So this is around Cancun, for those of you that may not be familiar with the area. And what we actually did was we developed an insurance product for the coral reef and beaches in the area. And here you can just see how this product was set up. So municipalities paid into this trust fund, and the municipalities was collecting a lot of fees actually from hotels and others that were really benefiting from the reef. So you can imagine a lot of hotels in the area are right on the beach. So you have a coral reef, which can mitigate storm surge significantly during, hurricane events. So, the hotels really value having this coral reef there because it limits flooding during a storm event. And then also at the same time, tourists, you can think coral reefs obviously are a clear tourist attraction. So it helps keep their beaches more vibrant and attractive to tourists that come into the area. So the way this insurance product works is then there's this trust fund, which then basically pays out when there's hurricanes of different limits. It's a parametric insurance product. So when a hurricane hits a specific zone at a specific speed, the insurance product will pay out. And what it does is it helps fund sort of ongoing maintenance. And then when it's paid out, a reef brigade that will go immediately into the reef after a hurricane event and basically help restore the reef to get it back up to its protective capacity as quick as possible, so that you don't lose any of these reef benefits. And the reef doesn't just decline in quality over time to begin with.
Martha,
so
we have 2 or 3 more minutes.
All right, I'll go fast. So this product actually paid out last year, which is really exciting. So there's this New York Times article I mentioned at the top, which shows the first payout of this product, and it's been renewed for another year. So just another example of thinking through nature-based solutions, coral reefs, as an asset that can really be protected and insured. So quickly, what I'm going to do with the last 2 minutes is just go through what we did at Nature Conservancy about 2 years ago was we worked with 8 companies on sort of interviewing them and developing a toolbook around strategies for operationalizing nature-based solutions in the private sector. Because, you know, sort of getting these to scale is a whole nother issue when you're working with companies, regulators, all of this other stuff that I've touched on. And one of the questions in the survey of these companies that we did was around what are the business drivers for thinking through nature-based solutions. And so I'm just showing those here to help folks think about, you know, why companies in particular may want to adopt these when they're not conservation organizations, right? So they're not going to adopt nature-based solutions because they want to protect a given area just to protect it, like an organization like the Nature Conservancy would. But there are a myriad, like managing regulatory risk, mitigating natural disaster risk, lowering project costs. So just to show all some of the stacked benefits that are really thought about in terms of these nature-based solutions. And so from that, what we did was we developed a roadmap for operationalizing nature-based solutions. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time here on this because I want to get to sort of the scaling challenges that we see going forward. But the main takeaway here is really that this is a long process, right? Getting folks to think about nature-based solutions and adopt them isn't something that's going to happen overnight. It requires sort of systemic change and driving thinking about nature-based solutions into the culture of companies and the engineering being done in a lot of these places. So what I want to leave you with is some of the 4 kind of challenges to scaling that we see in the work that has to happen in the next few years. One is just enhancing the understanding of the benefits of nature-based solutions and green-gray approaches in the public and private sector. So, you know, getting engineers to think about these solutions when they're developing projects and getting regulatory agencies to think that they should be approved, that they're not seen as overly risky when you're working to implement them or too novel to sort of test. More research to identify the revenue streams and innovative conservation finance mechanisms, particularly where there are stacked benefits. If you can get other stakeholders to pay for some of those stacked benefits, that can be a really effective means of financing restoration and protection of these areas that are valuable. Engagement across industries and sectors. So just to say, you know, engineers don't always know as much about nature-based solutions as maybe some conservation scientists, and conservation scientists don't know as much about the challenges to getting them adopted. So I think there's real value in getting groups together, especially when you're thinking about these cross-disciplinary issues. And then finally, continued shared learnings, right? So the more we can share about where nature-based solutions were effective and implemented, the more we can get others to see them as strategies to be adopted. So I'll leave you with that. Thanks, everybody.
All right, thank you, Martha. So our third provocateur will move from sort of that consideration of the change in external landscape, both from a tech standpoint and a nature standpoint, to an illustration of what you can do as an engineering company to begin to respond to those changes and begin to think about how do you formulate new value propositions, new business models that may fit the needs that clients have as they in turn respond to that landscape. So to do that, we've got Chris Murphy, who is the Global Chief Technology Officer with Black & Veatch. Chris has spent his career working in a whole variety of different software engineering and tech roles with companies in that industry before joining Black & Veatch in his current role. So with that, Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle. It is my pleasure to be here with you all this morning, and my pleasure to share this provocation about transitioning to digital business models. As I was thinking through how to talk about this, one of the things that occurred to me is that it's very difficult to talk about transitioning to digital business models if we don't first come into some agreement to what does it mean when we talk about a digital business. So I'm not sure, I can't see all the faces as if we were in a large audience, but I'm not sure if everyone is thinking the same thing about what is a digital business. So first, I want to give some context about what I'm talking about when I say digital business. Once I do that, the next thing is to make sure that we understand some of the questions that companies need to ask as they're considering the type of digital business that they're going to pursue or that they're pursuing. And then once we have that, we can look at some of the digital business models and look at some of the pitfalls that companies have to be aware of as they begin transitioning to those digital business models. So first, what is a digital business? And this is right from Gartner. Digital business is the creation of new business designs by blurring the physical and digital worlds. What does that really mean? Well, things that I think most of us are familiar with are things like Facebook. Facebook is a part of the digital economy, one of the first big digital economies, in addition to your Amazon. These are all digital businesses. Or maybe you might be more familiar with LinkedIn, or maybe Uber, or the list goes on and on, Netflix, and we can continue on. These are all different aspects of digital businesses. And as we're thinking about this, one of the things that we should also do is we should also think about what is our digital ambition as a company? What is it that we'd like to accomplish? One of the things that we need to think about when we think about digital businesses, as mentioned earlier, some of the social landscape has changed, social injustice, diversity and equity and inclusion. We need to think about sustainability. We need to think about it by putting the customer into the center and think about what their primary concerns are. Because if we're working to provide a service, more often than we need to line up our service to what the customers need. And oftentimes we're thinking about, hey, we just need to do the best engineering possible. And that's a great thing from an engineer's perspective, but not necessarily from a business perspective. The business perspective requires you to make that link and connection to create a very great relationship with a customer. Otherwise, the engineering effort becomes very transactional. So what is a digital business? It's a blurring of the line between the physical and digital world to make things a little bit more accessible, a little bit more organic from a customer-centric perspective. Now, before we start thinking about this, let's talk about strategy. And I'm not going to go through what your digital strategy should be, but some questions that you should ask in terms of evaluating your existing one and the one that you might need to craft in the future. And these are questions like, hey, when we look at what we do from an engineering perspective or procurement perspective or a construction perspective, how does digital technology change the business that you should be in? If we look back at what Stephen presented with capabilities that Autodesk provides, does that help change the type of engineering business that we should be able to offer to our customers? Does it perhaps expand the types of services that we can provide, the way that consultative engagement occurs? How can technology improve the way that we add value to the businesses that we're in? If we're able to offer our customer the ability to create parts of an aircraft or airplane that are half the weight with the same strength, does that provide value for our customers? If we're able to leverage machine learning to perhaps cut the engineering time that we have so that we're able to provide results so that they can do their construction and build out in half the amount of time, does that add value? Does it help them from a time to market perspective? Because sometimes that too will give them a competitive advantage. Does digital technology change our target customer? Sometimes when we look at the offerings that we have, maybe it expands the customers that we're able to access. Sometimes it allows us to look and see the low margin customers. Maybe they're not the customers that we want to continue doing business with because of the risk that we take on as a business. Maybe we have the opportunity to shift to higher margin customers, and maybe that's where we want to go. maybe not. Maybe we want to simply expand. These are all questions as a part of that strategy that companies need to ask, not only to think about what they will pursue, but also to think about what they will not pursue. Because at the end of the day, it's companies have to define how they execute at speed. Another question to ask is, does digital technology impact the value proposition to our target customers? In other words, is it good enough for us to give a stack of papers to our customers to say, hey, here's your design or files? Or would it be better for us to not only provide them with the design, but provide them a visual walkthrough in the case of construction engineering, civil engineering, to say, here is what this is going to look like. Here's where everything is. Here are your colors attached. Here are the brands of assets that we're putting in there. Here's what it looks like from various perspectives. We can attach it to Google Earth so you can navigate in there and see what that experience looks like, just in case you have a helipad somewhere in there. Does that visual experience aid? Does it aid them from a maintenance and operations perspective so that they know they can provide something to maintenance workers once the job is done, so that maintenance workers know where the equipment is that they actually need to change, to limit the number of times that they change the wrong part? These are all types of things that digital technology can enhance, add value to, and also can digital technology enhance the enterprise capabilities that differentiate your company from the competition? Does it give you the ability to establish some unique competitive advantage in order to insulate your company as a business? Once you begin to answer those questions, now it's time to, let's look at some digital business models. Now, these aren't all of the digital business models there are. It's just a handful. One of the things that companies would need to do is to look at the different business models, understand some of the reasoning behind it, and figure out what's appropriate for us as a company and what's appropriate for us that will give us better levers for us to interact with our customers. So the subscription model. I think a lot of people, I won't say everyone in the conference, but I suspect that most of us know who Netflix is, right? Subscription model. We pay them X dollars a month and we can go and binge on shows. How many people now don't understand why we have to sit through commercials because of what Netflix has provided us? The ability to go in and watch all the shows we want of things that we love and without commercial interruption, and we don't have to wait to stay tuned for next week. We can watch it now. Netflix is part of the ecosystem that's creating the now generation. We want to watch it now. That's why they drop a season and they'll call their friends and they'll watch that together. A razor and blades model. We've seen this in various forms. We talk about Amazon here with the Kindle. They give you a great price on the Kindle. And have you ever wondered why you're still paying the same amount for the books electronically as you did when it was in your hand? It's the convenience factor. Another example of that is HP. They will lose money to sell you an inkjet printer because they know they're going to make it up by selling you the ink. That's the razor and blades model, to come in lower cost because you know you're going to make it up with other services and products later on. The ecosystem model, where there's several products that maybe they're not the greatest individually, but they're integrated in a way that makes it so organic and immersive for you that you will beat the drum to your friends to say, hey, this, you have to use an iPhone, or you have to use an iPad. You need this great Samsung device with Android and the great camera that it has. That's the ecosystem model. And the razor and blades model, one of the benefits of it is, by jumping back and forth here, but the razor and blades model, one of the advantages when it has the community to foster it, the ecosystem model benefits from that as well, because that becomes marketing that's more effective than ad pop-ups that you'll ever see. Because as people, we tend to take more advice for people that we know and trust, and we'll try things new based on that as well. The free model is another one. How many of us use Facebook? We'll let you experience this for free. Just let us use your data. We see games that do that as well. Hey, go ahead, just give us this information so we can sell it to as many places as we can. That's the free model. And then finally, the LinkedIn freemium model. And we see this in many cases as well. Yes, we want to enhance your ability to meet professionals like yourself. And we'll let you do that for free because that is a service that the world needs. But if you need to do something different, like, hey, there's some things that you need to learn for your next opportunity, well, that will cost a few dollars more. Oh, you'd like to do some research on a number of companies, well, then you're really classified as a recruiter. That's an incremental fee for you to pay. And that's the freemium model. Now, as we're thinking about all of these different digital business models, and there are more, like there's a landlord rental model, the list goes on and on. As you're thinking about these, there are a few things to consider. One is that the business model that you find that is right for you today is good today, but in about 18 to 36 months, it may not be. One of the things that analysts have discovered is that as we've entered the digital age, the rate of business model change has begun to increase, such that companies need to consider whether or not their business model is appropriate every 2 to 5 years. Do you have things in place, skills, resources in place to help you evaluate business models and determine whether or not it's appropriate every 2 to 5 years? Here's another piece for your consideration. As in engineering firms, we're pretty technical, right? Well, when it comes to software, civil engineering or electrical engineering is not software engineering. And so our engineering firms are classified as non-technical entities from a software perspective. As we're thinking about the digital business, one of the doses of reality that we need to understand is that when we think about platform and service offerings, only 20% of the companies, non-technical companies, are successful in the software space. So there's some things that you need to investigate inside of your culture to see whether or not it's appropriate. Do you have the right mechanisms in your company to create a software product? In addition, there are 9 pitfalls in innovation that you should consider. Does your strategy match up to your digital ambition? Will you be able to put in the right level of investment to support that? And your innovation initiatives, will they be aligned to the strategy? And finally, will your strategy connect to your execution? Because oftentimes companies will say things like, hey, we're going to work on the work that matters. But middle management will say, well, hey, we've got all of these things that we still need to do to support other parts of our business. And that's where some of that strategy and execution disconnects. Another tier is process. Are there process gaps that you don't have? Processes that are undocumented? We think about our engineering processes, but what about all the handoffs that occur in proposal development, proposal execution, measuring our progress as we're developing our projects? So process gaps can derail your transformation to a digital business. Also, sometimes we don't really put the customer in the center and make sure that the processes are heading towards our customers, looking at business outcomes instead of looking at tasks that we need to perform. And the final one, from a process perspective, are around metrics. Oftentimes we measure things around how we're doing the engineering to progress there, but not necessarily our effectiveness. One of the things mentioned by Stephen or in the video was around how the ability of the thing designed had the ability to introspect itself and evolve. Well, our organizations need to be able to do that as well. One of the things organizations have to be able to do is continuously improve operational excellence. Is your organization ready for that? Do you have the metrics to inform you about how you need to change and when you need to change? And the last category of things is culture. Culture eats strategy every day of the week. Do you have a culture that is risk averse? There are studies that have shown that countries like Europe about 25 years ago had the most innovative companies, about 40 of the top 100 in the world. But today, that number has dropped to around 17. Why is that? A lot of innovators leave Europe to come to the US because of the diversity to build up their product. Then they move back to Europe. So risk aversion, internal politics damage the ability for you to innovate. A second thing is that not invented here syndrome. Sometimes our engineers are so trapped in what they've done for years that they're unwilling to listen and pivot. And the final thing is diversity. If you're sitting around the table making business decisions and everyone in the room looks like you probably don't have enough diversity. You need diversity of people and diversity of ideas. And it doesn't come when people look like you, talk like you, think like you, dress like you. You need to inject and import diversity in there. There's a statistic, and just to wrap this up, a statistic that says that in companies that import or have diverse teams, during that course of that year, they're 46% more likely to experience increased market share and 70% more likely to have that market share be in new markets. So just another case of diversity that I think Darshan will dig into a lot more later. So I think the real question is, what's your digital business? And once you understand what your digital business is, what digital business model is going to be right for you? And finally, is your company ready to make the transition to fulfill your digital ambition? Thanks, Kyle.
All right, Chris, thank you. So everyone, we're at our break time. So I want to go ahead and, with those great provocations, take a break. We've got various questions that have showed up in the chat. You might be commenting on those. We'll have, some opportunity later in discussion to see if we can return to those in whole group, but mostly we'll allow the chat function to try and capture that. So I'd like to take a 10-minute break. Right now it is about 11:20, I believe, Central Time. So we'll reconvene as a whole group and move into our first exercise when we return at 11:30 Central. So 10-minute exercise, and I want to make sure that we've got most people back from the break. So we're going to hold here for just a moment. You back?
Yeah, I'm back.
Oh, okay. Well, while we wait for a quorum with regard to moving into the exercise, what we might do is just spend a couple minutes opening up to any questions or comments that come from the group, responding to the provocations that were offered before our break. Any questions, comments that come to mind? I can also field some that were part of the chat. In this case, you can just unmute yourself and come forward.
Hi, Martha. This is Dominique. Uh, your presentation, the nature-based solutions, thought that was very interesting, and I was curious about how much thought, and I know there's a lot of it that goes into, what species you put in places, such as trees, grass, like, you know. Just very interesting to me. I want to know, like, what sort of studies you did. Were they, are they native? Was hoping you could go into that a little further.
Yeah, that's a good question. And to be honest, like, I'm an economist, I'm not an ecologist, so I'm like probably not the best person to answer that. But that being said, like most of the time, I think, in the ash pond example I showed there, the aim really was to plant it with native species, things that are going to be like robust, right? They're going to live like perennial. I think you really want to put in a diverse mix, and also like the right set that's going to be resilient to the environment of the area you're planting. And that sort of combined with some of the like coastal protection work around nature-based solutions can really just be looking at like, the protection of ecosystems that are already there. So like if there's already a mangrove forest, for example, like near some population areas where it's providing protective benefits, then the effort there would really be around like restoring them to make sure they're as healthy as possible, and then just protecting them. So it's not always just planting, but it can even just come down to like finance means to protect what you already have by acknowledging sort of the value it's providing in different spaces. Does that make sense? It's sort of an answer and not quite.
That did, yeah. It's probably my question's kind of sort of complicated, right? I'm sure there's a lot of studies that go involved in what species should go where and whatnot.
Yeah, and it's like a whole another niche field. Like we're the organization is doing a whole bunch of work in Louisville around tree plantings for urban heat sort of issues. And yeah, it's not my area, but there's like a whole realm of issues around like what kind of canopy does it provide? Is it effective at removing pollutants, or does it just trap them underneath the tree? Yeah, so it gets really complicated, and there are people that sort of specialize in that specifically, and unfortunately, it's not me.
Well, let me ask you actually, Martha, about that. I mean, how closely does the Nature Conservancy collaborate with engineering, environmental consulting firms in terms of being able to do the type of work that you were illustrating?
We do collaborate with some. I think it's an area where, to be honest, we're looking to collaborate more because we're sort of increasingly seeing the importance of working with engineers in the design of projects in a way that effectively incorporates nature and some of the nature-based solutions. So we have done some work with like AECOM, Jacobs in the past, but I think it's always an area where we're looking to do more as we sort of try to build out and drive the adoption of nature-based solutions more broadly.
Okay.
We've worked with the Nature Conservancy in the past on sanitary system design, nature-based type of things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we're going to move into our exercise at this point. And let me pull up a screen share just to brief you in terms of where we're going with this. And hold on just one second. The exercise is really designed to allow you to explore this idea of, given the changing landscape that clients and organizations face, how could engineering companies begin to think through new value propositions, new business models to help those clients thrive in that changing landscape. So we're going to put you into breakout groups, and in the breakout groups, first thing we'd like you to do is to very quickly put yourself into, or have some people volunteer to fill 3 particular roles: a discussion leader that can guide the discussion, a recorder who will be using the Google Doc and recording in your group, and you'll see that up above there's a group number. So when you get into your breakout group, find the page that relates to the group number that you're in, and then a presenter who's prepared to report out one or two key insights during the report out. For this exercise, the first thing we want you to do is to select a client type: government, institutional, private sector. You can go into more or less detail about that. On the government side, you can decide we're the federal government, no, we're state, or we're more of a local community or regional government. On an institutional side, do you want to be healthcare, or do you want to be educational or academic, et cetera? Private sector, you could choose a market if you wish, or you can stay more general. But then for that type of client, we have identified 3 particular global risks that the World Economic Forum identified as part of their survey of global risks that was published in 2021. And they differ for each one of the breakout groups. There's one risk that has to do with economic conditions. There's an environmental global risk and a technological global risk. And what we'd like you to do is to consider those global risks as having been sort of risen to the top of the particular client type that you've selected to work on. So they're really concerned about those particular global risks, and then move into a reflection or an exploration about, first, how will those high priority risks impact the client type you selected? And there's some prompts there that will allow you to, explore that question. And then after you've got a sense, how will clients be responding to those global risks in terms of either managing them or mitigating them, adapting to them, et cetera. Then look at, well, how might an engineering company or consulting engineering firm provide assistance or service to that client type dealing with those risks? And what does that suggest about possible new value propositions or business models? So that'll be the exercise. At the end of it, we'd like you, at the end of your small group discussion, quickly sort of identify 1 or 2 key insights that came out of your discussion that you'd like to report out to the whole group. You'll have a total of about 40 minutes in your breakout groups, including setting your roles, getting, making a decision with regard to the client type. Hopefully do that fairly quickly, and then move into the substantive part, which are the questions. With that, Mike, I'm going to let you get people into their small groups, and I will leave the screen share.
All right, I'm opening the rooms, and 40 minutes, as Kyle said. Here we go.
Hi, Mike.
All right. So we want to, take a few moments to at least capture some of these key insights. And I will note, due to all these time limitations, we'll report out, we'll ask each group just to offer one of their key insights as a quick report out. Keeping in mind, if you've got additional insights there, that's great. And or if there are things you haven't gotten typed in yet, if you can go ahead and add them. Because after the session, Mike takes the lead, and we will put together a summary of the meeting, which will mine this Google Doc in terms of the different notes that the small groups put in. So we are interested in those key insights, even if you don't have time to report them all out to the whole group. They'll be taken into account in terms of our thinking about how to summarize what we're learning in this exploration. So with that, what I'd like to do, as I say, is just round robin to each one of the groups, and have have your presenter just highlight what was one of the key insights that you took away from this exercise, exploring those global risks, thinking from a perspective of the client type that you chose, and then thinking about how engineering companies could create value, think about new ways of or new potential value propositions for those clients. So with that, I'm just going to go down the list. Group 1, if you could offer one of your insights.
For Kyle.
I don't know who that is.
Kyle, this is Matt. I'm the presenter for Group 1. Do you want me to go through our scenario and our insights overall, or?
I would just say, you know, you might just note what type of client that you chose, and then I would just go to the insight.
Okay. So we chose a government client, and specifically we thought about a Department of Transportation and how they may be impacted. And the scenario presented was quite stark for our team. I'm not sure if all the teams had that scenario, but we thought about the insights that overall that the DOT may need to have an opportunity to think bigger, to think more holistically, to think beyond highways and bridges, they really have an opportunity with all the land interests that they have to provide solutions that Martha described earlier with the nature-based solutions, because of all the land that they have, and particularly in rural areas. The other insight that we had is there's a huge opportunity for the DOTs to get in the activity of electrification with power grids on roads, and the ability to perhaps even generate revenue from these grids on the roads, and just the whole electrification of vehicles will require different solutions from engineers, and particularly in how engineers have served DOTs over the years. It's been pretty standardized, if you will, and this will require different thinkings in our team. We mentioned the Envision approach would have value, and there would be, you know, more opportunities for electrical engineers, perhaps bundled services, advocacy to help DOTs perhaps change their standards, legislators to change policy and statutes, so that the DOTs really have the jurisdiction to think differently.
Okay.
So I think those are some of the key insights. Certainly more partners to bring into the fold as well, along with thinking bigger.
All right, great. Thanks, Matt. Good job. Group 2.
Group 2's their scenario was around the World Economic Forum's report. So a set of clients have read this and made some assessment. The World Economic Forum focused on economic, environmental, and kind of some technological challenges that are coming up. We selected a private sector client to focus on, and our group had a variety of backgrounds to speak to that particular problem. Some of the insights include one of the points that came out last. Jim Haynes mentioned that private companies respond to stakeholders. And so things like the environmental concerns, a private sector response would be there because their stakeholders of that private sector concern would be interested in it, you know? And so as a result, the companies, this group of consulting companies, engineering consulting companies, would necessarily need to be responsive to that. Some of the challenges that we talked about are having long-term perspectives with private sector. You know, how do you have, Teal mentioned the 200-year perspective. How do you have the 200-year perspective when you're working with a private sector company? And other insights came from some of the conversation around financial and kind of immediate return focus of a private sector, and also some of the conversation around tax structures. So at any rate, I think one of the insights was just coming from looking at short-term versus long-term.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Doug. Group 3.
This is Patty. I'm reporting for Group 3. So we had government, public agencies. That was our perspective. And some key insights we had is the importance of diversity of thought, less resilience on established standards, which may be outdated. And then also maybe there needs to be a shift in focus. Maybe consultants drive community-based or community-driven projects that also include funding sources for that project. You know, typically consultants go to an agency and, you know, submit an RFP for a project or propose a project to an agency, but maybe the shift goes to public-driven projects. And the other thing we talked about, key point, was maybe shed the traditional methods of calculating profit margins and incorporate more long-term holistic value to projects.
All right, great. Thank you, Patty. Group 4.
Yeah, this is Brant Lahnert. I'm the speaker for Group 4. I'm not showing my screen because I had surgery on Friday. I'm sparing you the image of me lying on a couch in a sling with a ice pack on my shoulder. We chose a private sector client, and in this dystopian future, we thought the project would be a large urban redevelopment, perhaps several blocks in an urban area. And we were envisioning the complexity of the project having to be, you know, basically measure up to all the needs, environmentally, socially, certainly sustainability issues, those kind of things. And well, cyber attacks was in there as well. The complexity of these problems are only solved by groups of smart people working together and solving them. No one person can solve these problems. We like the idea of the master builder, but it's a master builder made up of a lot of people who, similar to neurons in a brain, perhaps. But the concept of the unified solution, or the perfect solution that a master builder might be able to create, is the idea, because it has to include the idea of social awareness, social justice, and, you know, sustainability for sure, electrification, all these sorts of things. These are really complex problems solved by groups of people working together. And our current, sort of what I would call adversarial process doesn't really foster that kind of interaction. Owners are adversarial to builders, who are adversarial to designers in the private sector generally. So new ideas, integrated project delivery is one that's around right now that's getting a lot of airplay. I'm wondering, in our topic, which is engineering firms of the future, if the large multidisciplinary firm, we see a lot of movement toward consolidation into large multidisciplinary firms. And is that the future of the engineering firm? Is that small firms won't be there because we're not answering the problem?
All
Is
right.
that enough?
Yeah, that's enough, Brent. Thank you. I appreciate that. Those are good. I really like that sort of, you know, collective master builder concept that you were, you know, exploring there. So group number 5, please.
Yes, this is Jorge. We took the institutional for a change. And of course, dealing with the same issues, economic, environmental, and technological, which, you know, it really sums up to, you know, economic, there's really no money. Environmental, the institution would need to take a stand and kind of decide what their take is on these environmental issues. And same with technology, we need to make sure that our footprint, our communities doesn't get impact, and we are proactively solving some of these issues. But the key insights that we came up with is that we definitely need to be able to position ourselves to address all these institutional risk, and how do we sell these long-term planning and resilient solutions? Because that's, I guess, with every institution, with every type of agency, that's kind of the challenge, right? We might have buy-in, we might have all the facts, but ultimately selling the issue is a problem, and we need to do a better job on selling that. We definitely need to have collaborative teams with stakeholders and other community leaders and groups. This would help us form kind of coalitions that will hopefully provide some type of pressure / support to the institution and understanding, you know, the bigger issue at hand. We definitely need to look for partnering opportunities to deliver the turnkey solutions to basically take the strain out of our institutional clients. And we want to make sure that our clients really understands and envision what the good looks like. So if there's another institution that, for example, has adopted a certain technology, adopted a certain practice, involve them in our team and not really just show them, you know, this is what this other facility is doing, but maybe bring in a leader or someone that implemented that solution in another institution to talk to them so they can probably have some common ground, understand the changes, and, you know, they could probably talk the same language from institution to institution.
Great. Thanks, Jorge. All right, group number 6, please.
Hi, it's Lindsay. I will report for group number 6. Our client was government, but more the municipality government. And as we were having discussions, we kind of had these overarching insights come out of our discussions. One of them was risk response, helping them develop operations and maintenance programs with resiliency in mind, and promote design beyond just the code and standards, promoting innovation, so just supporting the clients to keep up with rapidly emerging challenges and trends, like, for instance, cybersecurity, economics of scale, opportunities to foster collaboration and partnering across the municipalities. That was one of those discussions of sharing information across municipalities, and also more standardization amongst the municipalities and sharing information.
Okay.
Let's see here. It was very similar to a lot of what other people said. The standard contract and process that goes with standard consulting firms in municipalities can get in the way of having a more holistic project view. And then also we had talked about looking at projects not so narrow-minded as just looking at it as a technical project, technical problems.
Seeing the bigger picture again.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. And group number 7, finally.
Yes, this is Britt Smith. I'm speaking for 7, and a lot, you know, as the last group, a lot of the stuff that we've talked about has actually already been covered. But we chose a governmental state DOT as our client, and we talked a lot about the same things that have already been mentioned. But to key on one point was, you know, the diversity of, we need to develop a diversity of team members, not only from a standpoint of diversity of background, but by diversity of training and education, so that we can bring other mindsets into the problem-solving process. You know, the struggle that we just in getting there was the billing aspect of it, is, you know, the traditional billable hours, and, you know, if we have a liaison on board with educational institutions or other nature conservatories, et cetera, how is that person, you know, going to be billable in the traditional model? So we see that as a barrier to this, but the law, by not doing it, it's the loss of opportunity cost. You know, what are we losing in our opportunity in gaining market share by not doing it, by not looking beyond the engineering field for solutions. Although as an engineer, we usually are right, but
okay.
But that said, in being much more collaborative.
All right, great. All right, well, thank you to all the groups. I think what I'm going to do is call our lunch break. When we come back from lunch, we're going to have 2 more provocations that, as I said earlier, they're sort of bridge provocations. They work, I think, within the context of this discussion about thinking about new value propositions and possibilities for new business models, et cetera. But they also work as emerging value sets, I believe, with regard to the values of the workforce that may be moving into the future. Once we've done those provocations, we'll come back and present out the research that's been done, both in terms of focus group, but more particularly the web-based survey that Darshan Karwat and his team have put together. And then we'll move into an exercise about that value mindset aspiration piece. So with that, I think I'm going to shorten our lunch break just a little bit to 15 minutes. Right now it's, I think, 12:40 Central Time. So we'll come back and get started with our next provocations at 12:55, please. So 15 minutes.
Well, should we go ahead and get started and let people catch up as they join on here?
Yes.
All right. So as I mentioned at the start of our break, we've got two provocateurs that really serve this bridge function for us. The first of them is Doug Melton, who's with the Kern Family Foundation. And, Doug's position there is as a program director. He's been with Kern, I guess, since 2012, and doing, I think, some really significant work in the engineering world with regard to their mission in the Kern Foundation, which he'll tell you about. Doug's background, I hadn't realized this. He's a double E by engineering background, but he's also a musician, as we were just talking about, researcher, entrepreneur, and a variety of other things. So welcome, Doug, and take it from there.
Well, thank you very much. And first of all, thanks. I really do appreciate the opportunity to be part of this group. I was thinking about Brant's comments and group number 4's comments in the previous session around not having adversarial relationships, but really collaborating in new ways. And so I think that you'll see some of that come up in the ending of my provocation. Stephen, I appreciated your talk about new tools. And my interest is, how do we get the minds around those new tools to do something really great with them? Martha, I really appreciated her provocation around systems thinking and how it's connected to the environment and nature. Chris's provocation around thinking about business models, revisiting your business model every, somewhere between 2 and 5 years is what he said, and a call for diverse thinking. So how do you get all these things wrapped into one idea? And I will tell you, over my career in both industry and academia and at a foundation, I have realized how important hires are. And you may realize the same thing in your company. I mean, if you start taking, earlier there was a mention of the 200-year perspective. The hires that you're making and the way you're thinking about the talent and the future workforce and what that talent brings to the table sets a trajectory, not just for 5 years that they may, or 10 years, but it sets a long trajectory. And it's maybe not just the trajectory of a company, it's a trajectory of an industry, trajectory of a society, trajectory of a nation, affects a region, a community. This talent, the workforce, is critically important. So I've got a little bit of a story and a couple of questions I want to throw up on the screen, and I'll walk us through a provocation. Being the academic type, it seems like my provocations tend to be formed in questions, but one of the questions I'll scratch out and make more of a statement. But I start with a question. And let me get my screen so I can see this well. So my question is, what if every engineer were entrepreneurially minded? And the next part of that is, would that be welcome, or is that just a frightening proposition to you all? I mean, what do you think when you hear we've got an entrepreneurially minded engineer joining our company? Is that a good thing, or is it like, oh no? I'll tell you, there's some of both, and let's talk through this a little bit. But I think that's one of the questions I want to raise, and I'll even come back to this question near the end. Here's the story. You know, when I was teaching, I was taught electrical engineering. I was prior in industry before that. I got connected to a group, this foundation that I'm working for now, the benefactors, Robert and Pat Kern. And they started the company that you may or may not know. It's Generac, but they build generators and they hold other companies and so on. It's a multinational company these days, but he sold the company. And I went to work for this group partly because of a really noble collection of missions that are around a set of ideas. Here's the ideas. I'll put them up on the screen. So it became the Kern Family Foundation, and the proceeds of the sale of that company turned into a collection of ideas on how do we do things that are associated with these animating ideas. Character, education, purposeful and meaningful work, purpose and meaningful work. And this last one is where I landed, you know, coming out of a spin-off company, working in kind of a startup venture and so on. I mean, it fit me very well, but when I taught for years, 17 years teaching, as a faculty member, I recognized that there was something missing in just the technical content. And there was something about this entrepreneurial mindset. But before you make a judgment call on what you think entrepreneurship or entrepreneurial mindset is, walk through a few things with me here, because it's not about creating new startup companies. It's broader than that. And so I'll unpack that a little bit with a few questions and a little bit of presentation. And then some of those questions get back to a provocation. Think, how does this play? Now, here's one of the things that I find the easiest to do to make this a little more dynamic. I've got a 2-minute video that a few faculty across 50 universities are using, and they put this in front of freshmen. It's just 2 minutes. Watch this. It's probably better than me trying to explain it right at the top. It's kind of enjoyable.
A growing number of universities, businesses, and authors are recognizing the need for the United States to produce engineers with an entrepreneurial mindset. With the help of Daniel and Alicia, 2 students who just graduated with engineering degrees, we'll look at what this mindset is and what it isn't. Daniel and Alicia received their degrees from a university that teaches traditional engineering with an emphasis on problem solving and technical acumen. When they arrive at their new jobs, they receive the specifications and get straight to work. They apply the technical skills they acquired in college and even demonstrate some innovation, but that's where their engagement ends. Daniel and Alicia focused on the problem at hand and executed the task they were given, but they did not engage the company's customers or anticipate new market opportunities. Eventually, global competition eroded the company's market share until it was no longer profitable. Could an entrepreneurial mindset have led to a more positive outcome? This time, Daniel and Alicia began by asking questions. Recognizing the problem as an opportunity, they talk with customers about their needs. The answers make them reconsider the purpose of the new specifications. The feedback leads them to the realization that there are different markets. When they analyze societal and economic trends, it becomes clear that one market segment will grow. The specification handed to them is not the answer. Instead, they propose an alternate technology that better serves the growing market. In this process, Daniel and Alicia simultaneously evaluated the need, the market, societal trends, and technical feasibility. Now that they understand the full range of opportunities, Daniel and Alicia collaborate with each other and with colleagues to design a product that exceeds the specifications, achieves cost savings, and expands into new business opportunities. They exhibited the attributes of entrepreneurially minded engineers, helping their employer meet with commercial success.
You know, you put that in front of freshmen, they will give you some feedback. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative, but they will tell you what they think about something like this. So here's 3 pieces of feedback that come back. I'll highlight the yellow. Almost any engineer can use their skills to complete the task, but many of them complete the task given, but how many can exceed expectations and take steps to solve the problem? Or this next one. The entrepreneurial mindset can't really be applied here because they're expected to create the product. Or the next one. You know, placing this burden on engineers' shoulders sounds like a solution, but it's another burden that these engineers might not want to face. And it's kind of interesting. They're not all negative. Some are positive, some are negative, but the freshmen, you put this in front of them and say, this is the way you're framing, this is the way these new faculty members that are taking this message and delivering it, not just with a video, but actually in classroom activities, they're framing engineering differently. They're looking at it like this is about creating value for people. And it just takes on a different look. And that means your job is not just calculations. Calculations are becoming a commodity. And so how do you actually create value for people has become the question and the framing for some of the academic paths at these institutions. And it's good, I think. It's not without debate, but it's good. I want to show you something that, we work with a number of leaders. Steve Kaplan here, president of University of New Haven, says, I don't think that businesses and companies that are engaged in various branches of engineering understand the absolutely essential imperative to have entrepreneurially minded employees. And even he sometimes takes a national perspective in his writings. I don't think we are there yet as a nation. And I think that's part of our problem. Well spoken. I think that's coming from an academic. So what do people in industry think? Well, McKinsey & Company did a study, and they do lots of studies. This is one study that was beyond hiring, how companies are reskilling to address the talent gaps. So the study actually went out to, I think it's somewhere around almost 1,300 companies. And they said, what do you think? Do you think we'll have skills gaps in the next few years? 43% said yes. And then another 44% said, well, within 5 years, we're going to have them. Well, how will that affect what risk, what part of your work is going to be disrupted by this? A significant part, basically, is what many of them say. So the headline here is that 87% say that they're either experiencing gaps now or they expect to within a few years. And now you go, okay, what are you doing about it? What are we not just doing about it as an industry player, but also even how that connects to the academy and it connects to graduates and how are we shaping that with that gap? Well, the report continues and says, reskilling programs often focus on building these things. You see them in the first 3 rows: critical thinking, leadership, advanced data analysis. Those are some of the key things, but the list is longer. And even somewhere on that list, let me move my screen so I can see it too, is entrepreneurship and initiative taking. So companies are saying, there's something to this even within the company. And while it may not top the charts right now, it's an important part. I think it probably, this is, look at the color coding on this. You'll see that this lighter blue color is connected to social and emotional skills is how they put it. Interesting. Almost a mindset piece, not so much like a hard skill demonstrate piece, but this is something else. So companies are recognizing some of that. We had a fellow, Dan Stuckey, Vice President of Specialty Power and Lighting Products for Energizer Company, that got kind of like the ECL Engineering Change Lab community. They said there's something that we need to be looking at here. And so he offered to take it upon himself to do a study. And he had the right street cred. I mean, comes from an R&D group. He's in strategic ventures, that sort of thing. And so his study was going to aim at understanding what is the level of appreciation of this entrepreneurial mindset within your new engineering graduates. I'm going to go around and visit a bunch of companies. And because he's got the position he has, he can probably get in and talk to the right people. And some of those companies included consulting firms, by the way. And other companies, the list was long. I'll show you where the companies are located. Can't show you the list, but the companies were primarily Ohio. Some of them were consulting firms. Some of them were offices of Google, Apple, Firestone. You can imagine the companies that surround Ohio that include manufacturing information in a fairly industrialized state. So you've got a lot of activity and a lot of people to talk to. And what you want to do is get in and talk to the people that have some influence on those hires, and that the culture and the next group cohort that people are brought into the company, you know. So he did this. I got the picture of the Energizer Bunny. He probably wouldn't appreciate that, but I got the picture of the Energizer Bunny on the map there, and he went around and traveled to a variety of companies and wrote a report. And, you know, the first thing he realized is he needs a way to talk about entrepreneurial mindset. Well, we had a convenient way because this community had been talking about this artificial separation between mindset and skill set. And I want to put this, maybe make this a little bit accessible. So easy way to, you know, metaphorically, a tandem bike is a good example. These things are not separable. Mindset and skill set, they go together. You could say that skill set powers things, mindset guides things in some ways. Here's a good example that I like to use. If you think about a surgeon and you hope your surgeon has a skill set, you desperately hope your surgeon has a skill set, but you also want them to have a mindset, right? You want them to have a mindset around care for the human condition. You want to have a mindset around kind of the being interested in the latest cutting edge technologies that will help. All of those things, that's not necessarily just their current skill set. It's something else. It's this mindset that looks to trends, the future, and so on. There's something unique about that. You hope your police officer has both the mindset and skill set. Like a skill set, you'd want them to have a skill set around how to handle a weapon, how to drive a vehicle, how to speak authoritatively. But you want them to have a mindset. It's not exactly a skill, a mindset around the importance of law, you know, the rule of law, civil safety. These aren't exactly skills that you can just pin down to one thing, but it's a mindset to have a fully kind of energized. So what about the engineer? You want the engineer to have the skills, and we have, as an educational community, focused so much on the science side of skills and the analysis side. Sometimes we miss that part about, this is really about the art of creating value for others, creating value that scales, creating value that helps a municipality. That's really what it comes down to. You know, I used to always ask students, like, why did you become an engineer? And you meet this new group of, you know, green freshmen, and you go through and you'd say, why do you become an? Too many of them answer, I was good in math and science. And the real answer is, you want to be good at creating value for people, we'll use your math and science skills. So there's a mindset piece here that needs to come to the forefront. So we had a language for Dan to go around to these companies. We had a framework, and he would roll out this framework. It's like a placemat almost. And it has a few pieces. I'm not going to go through all the language on these pieces, but I'll hit the 3 high points. The 3 high points are, an entrepreneurial mindset is somebody who's really curious. You know, as much as you don't like that person sitting on the plane next to you that's asking questions, that's a curious part. You want somebody who's curious about trends, curious about where things are going, curious about the business. You also want somebody that thinks in a very connected way. I saw this with what Martha Rogers was talking about. That was brilliant. That insurance idea around that also helps the environment. I mean, and it plays into free market. There's so many good connections there in that thing that she was describing, because it also creates value for people. And fundamentally, that's why it works. So in a free market society, it doesn't have to be entirely regulated. It creates value for people. So that's exciting stuff when you can get students or get your graduates to have an entrepreneurial mindset, hire people with this. And we work on different skills, and the skills, skills is different than mindset, but you can develop skills on how to identify opportunities. You can actually teach and learn that. Of course, you can develop skills around the traditional engineering stuff, around requirements and technical design. And some skills that we underplay are things like communicating and engineering a solution in economic terms. You all know that if you don't do that top right box, nobody cares. But this increasingly important one is the second one, communicating engineering solutions in terms of societal benefits. How do you actually develop that in somebody educationally? That's fun and it's important. So Dan went around to these different companies. He also took this, which is not something that came from the Kern Family Foundation. Here's the disclaimer, but it is about being entrepreneurial inside a company. Say you've got a big company with 40 offices. I enjoyed reading, by the way, I read the backgrounds of CP&Y, Mead and Hunt, Lap, Reinerson, CNS. I was reading about your origins and your mission statements to understand like where you're all coming from, trying to understand it. I've appreciated this meeting. That when Dan went around to some of these things probably resonated with certain people. I look at the 10 commandments, come to work each day willing to be fired. Circumvent orders aimed at stopping your dream. What he was saying is you need some disobedient engineers. Not to tear things down, but you need some that will push on some new avenues. What a term to use. So anyway, he took some
You've got
items around.
2 or 3 minutes.
Okay. Took some of these items around, and we have, while Dan was doing that sort of stuff, we were forming Keen. Keen is a group of colleges that have taken on this task of, let me just show you a few partner institutions. You might recognize some of the logos as they fly by. These are institutions that have said yes to, we're going to educate engineers this way. They're at these locations. There's 50 across the country. It represents somewhere around 35,000 engineers that are getting a new dose of value creation. If you want a little bit of detail, which disciplines, here's a quiz for you. Which disciplines love this the most? Biomedical. Which disciplines had a little trouble with this? Mine, electrical. Which disciplines said, I don't think this applies to us because it's all about products? Civil, but then they sort of changed their mind and said, we often end up in consulting and creating value for people. So it's been an interesting reception. I won't get into this too much. Should you create a center of innovation within your company, or should you integrate? This is the one question that became a statement. You need to integrate this into your company. That's a provocation. So back to the top. What if every engineer were entrepreneurially minded? I believe it would move the needle through more networks of value creation. And I can talk a little bit more about that, maybe answer questions about it. So what? Is there an action to take? I actually am working with a number of universities that are really interested in connecting to industry in new ways, not just an industry advisory board, not just co-op and interns, but building bridges between these two. There's some things to do. It would take a long time to unpack, but that's the provocation.
All right, thank you, Doug.
Thanks.
That sense of what happens when all those thousands of students who are now entrepreneurial minded join the workforce, become part of your workforce, and now you can begin to see them as an opportunity in terms of shifting your own cultures and creating new forms of value like we were talking about before the break. Okay, so that notion of entrepreneurial mindset as an emerging value set perhaps inside organizations. A second one that we wanted to highlight in this bridge provocation is the idea of technological stewardship. And this really is the heart and soul of work that's been done up in Canada. Engineering Change Lab Canada, led by Mark Abbott, who we really modeled our effort off of. They were about 3 years ahead of us, and we have just learned an awful lot from them over the years. We're on a little bit different paths. The path they're taking now really is a major emphasis and investment into this idea of promulgating technological stewardship as fundamental to engineers and the engineering community. So, Mark, if you want, or I should note, Mark is an engineer. He's spent a lot of time with Engineers Without Borders, helping build those programs, both in country, but also on the executive level with Engineers Without Borders Canada. Has been led the Change Lab up in Canada for 6, 7, 8 years now, I forget which, and has been a key advisor for us down here. So with that, Mark.
Yeah, and that's great. Thanks, Kyle. And the other quick piece on the career path was when I came straight out of school, I spent 15 years in consulting engineering, so very familiar with the world you're in. And in a lot of ways, my own journey of sort of my own relationship to engineering over time is a big fuel and for the work I'm doing. Like this kind of mixture of pride and power in what I found in engineering, but also the sense something was missing and not quite right. So I have my own kind of personal journey in all of this. Doug, it was great to follow you on this. I've been tracking the Kern Family Foundation work for a while. I've been on Engineering Unleashed, tracking things for a while. Haven't had a chance to go super deep, so this was great to get kind of a broader overlay of everything. And I think what we'll see in this is that actually a lot of what we're doing with Engineering Change Lab Canada and technological stewardship, I think, is same foundational sort of thinking with just slightly different framing and entry. So I'd love to follow up even afterwards and have a deeper conversation about that. So on today's theme of the engineering firm of the future, what are the engineering employees of the future going to look like? Basically, as Kyle alluded to, in Canada, we've become to shorthand this sort of future higher potential of engineering around the concept of technological stewardship. So on the slide here, you can see some of our new branding, where we're actually very consciously, we have kind of the Engineering Change Lab as behind the scenes and technological stewardship as actually a bigger concept we're promoting. So for today's provocation, I'd actually like to just share where Engineering Change Lab Canada is in terms of the stakes we put in the ground around this approach as our provocation, and sort of would welcome sort of reactions to that. And so in the first half, I'll share a little bit more about the tech stewardship frame and our theory of change around it, sort of the high level. In the second half, I'll talk more about how we're practically taking it out into the world, including a potential opportunity for your consulting firms to incorporate technological stewardship into your service offering. So quickly, what is technological stewardship? So we define it as the behavior that ensures technology is used to make the world a better place for all. And our mission is to help members of the engineering community embrace the identity of I'm a tech steward. So that just becomes the new normal in the field. So the tech stewardship brand is kind of like the bigger sort of like brand for the movement, or the way of talking about the movement. And ultimately, we don't really care if people use that specific term. It's more about what's kind of encompassed in the idea. The Engineering Change Lab, on the other hand, in Canada, is that sort of is working behind the scenes in service of technological stewardship and bringing it to the engineering community. So ECL's goal is to help create a tipping point. This is what the goals become after 6 years, is within the next 10 years to help reach a tipping point where 25% of Canada's engineering community is practicing technological stewardship. And what social science shows is if you can get the 25% of a system, if you could target the innovators and early adopters and get to 25%, the rest of the system will tend to follow. And that's the logic behind the 25% tipping point goal. We often start a lot of our engagements with this kind of icebreaker, strategic icebreaker, which is what's the default trajectory of humanity's relationship with technology? And we've run this like hundreds of times, big groups, small groups, engineers, non-engineers, and you almost always get like a diversity across the whole spectrum. And you start to see archetypes of responses, like, on the optimistic side, well, yeah, we're creating all these new technologies, but we're getting the tools to solve the problems faster than the problems are cropping up, or the arc of human history has been kind of positive in terms of development. On the pessimistic side, there's almost always a movie for the failure mode of the tech society relationship, or Black Mirror is almost an anthology of like 30 episodes of failure modes. So we know in our storytelling as a species that getting this relationship is right. And what this icebreaker does is help to get engineering out of its siloed, kind of inward looking into the bigger story we're a part of. And what it reminds us is innovation and technology and the products of engineering are not necessarily taking us to the world we want to go to. If we wind up in one of those Black Mirror episodes, we will have innovated our way into it. So we can't keep going with the same mental models and paradigms of innovation and technology and engineering if we want to avoid these more pessimistic outcomes. So a lot of it becomes actually asking some of these big philosophical questions that are sort of like the flip side of engineering strength, like we're practical problem solvers, like just give me the definition, just tell me the problem. So we don't spend as much time relative to other professional communities on some of these bigger questions about our role in society, or even the base question of what is engineering? In practice, definitions of engineering tend to be very narrow and restrictive. In rhetoric, they're often like overly broad and almost like so big that they mean nothing. And so we use to help set the stage in our conversations, the concept of engineering being the process of creating, applying, and maintaining technologies, in particular artifact-based technologies, physical, digital, biological, because social technologies is typically a domain of others. Technology, on the other hand, is the means by which humans adapt our environments to meet our needs and wants. So that could be physical environments, social environments, economic environments. What reestablishing this connection between engineering and this bigger sense of technology does is connects us to an amazing, huge world of study around the relationship of tech and society. On a typical campus, on one side of campus, we're training people to create the technological artifacts. On the other side, in the social sciences, there's people that are learning how to understand the complex coevolution of society with technology, and those groups rarely talk right now. So if there's technology as kind of the output, engineering the process, engineering community is then the people involved in the process of engineering. And we believe that that needs to involve a lot more than just engineers and computer scientists. The process is too important to be left to just those groups. So this is actually part of a graphic that we helped write an open letter with Engineers Without Borders International the other year, where the observation we had is like, if you take the graduate attributes and the professional competencies that are used globally, the challenge is you can read those same competencies and attributes with an underlying narrow view or broader view of engineering. And what it's rooted in is there's a default sort of narrow view of the outcomes of engineering right now, i.e. technology, as just neutral artifacts. And if you take the word technology, people tend to associate that with only digital these days. But if you spend some time talking to the social scientists who study tech and society, they'll quickly challenge you to understand engineering, the whole inception, development, and use of technology as being value laden. And you can only understand it in this complex social construction, not just by looking at the artifacts. And in fact, physical, digital, biological, even social technologies are all entwined. So as we expand the view of the nature of the outcomes of the engineering process, it leads to a natural expansion of what the engineering process itself must include. From one where there's a default current paradigm of a right answer where a specialized group can kind of come in with a micro-analytical mindset, similar to what Doug was saying, it's just like, we got our problem, type frame problem, we're off to the races, to one where, wait a minute, when we realize the power we're already wielding in society and these outcomes, it's actually not about finding a right answer, because the technologies we're creating are always meeting human needs and wants, and there's no consensus on needs and wants. So it's actually about finding the best answer with competing perspectives and values. And that needs to be more integrated with other professional disciplines and more democratic in its nature. It needs to look at the macro, not just the micro issues. And we need to bring critical thinking in, because there isn't a right answer. The myth of rationality in engineering needs to be challenged. And so when we expand our view of the outcomes and the process, that leads to an expanded view of the responsibility and opportunities of individuals in the engineering communities and individual firms. And the key to all of this is infusing the critical reflection about engineering and its outcomes that's lacking from the current engineering path right now. All of this in service ultimately to increased benefit for all. And you can put different kind of labels on that, but what is this all about? Why are we doing this? To increase benefit for all. So that's at more of a philosophical level. What we developed in terms of this is this concept of technological stewardship, behavior that ensures technology is beneficial for all. So how do we build from the ground level up to this big concept in the clouds? We see sort of the grounding as being self and system awareness. And then the foundation is technological understanding about the nature of technology and its complex relationship with society. Too often right now, by default, this foundation is cracked because engineers are not being trained and promoted to understand the complex nature of the technology they're creating. They know how to create it, and they know the technical aspects of the creation, but not the complex outputs. So we're building on a faulty foundation. And therefore, as we go out and try to be purposeful, responsible, inclusive, regenerative in our efforts, we can't build as strong or as true because the foundation is cracked. Also, a lot of current efforts tend to focus on one of these pillars to the exclusion of the others. And you can almost sort of like do as a mental exercise, what if I have an initiative that's being super purposeful, but fails to be responsible? Or, you know, is great at being regenerative, but fails to be inclusive? If you're working for a nonprofit, like in my own path, I went from sort of like working in an engineering firm into a nonprofit world. In the nonprofit world, we can be more focused on one issue and one pointy thing. For 95% of engineers are working in contexts where they have to balance out all of these different considerations. And that's where the roof that we show that integrates this in our metaphor is value sensitivity. And it's built right into the definition of technological stewardship, benefit for all, beneficial for all. Who is all? What is beneficial? And what this is recognizing is it's breaking that myth of rationality in engineering. There is no rational right answer because different people will value different things. And so it's about recognizing that and becoming more intentional about the decisions we're making. So to take a very simple example, the cell phone, I might value my privacy, you might value convenience. Neither is wrong. It's actually about trying to find solutions that can hit both of those things. So from this, we developed a set of behavioral principles that were basically form technological stewardship. So people say, okay, I love this concept makes sense. How do I do it? Well, these are written to be the sort of behavioral trailheads that people can apply in different contexts. So when we talk about technological stewardship, it basically means applying these behaviors, not in an a la carte way, because as we just talked about, it actually all needs to be integrated together. So seek purpose, take responsibility, expand involvement, widen approaches, advance understanding, realize diversity, deliberate values, seek regeneration. And we have, a double click on each of these where we talk about the old paradigm around these different behaviors, the new paradigms, different reflective questions that kind of take you deeper in these different pieces. All of this is now part of our bigger theory of change, which I won't go through in detail, but I can share some more afterwards. Ultimately, the long-term impact we want is technology helping make the world a better place. The 10-year outcome that we're very tangibly looking at is getting to that tipping point of 25% in Canada. So we estimate the engineering community in Canada to be about 500,000 people. We take a broad definition, not just engineers, but computer scientists and others involved in the process. So 500,000 people, 25% is 100,000 people. And our goal over the next 10 years is how do we get 100,000 people not just aware of this bigger way of thinking of engineering, but actually practicing these behaviors. And very tangibly, it's like, okay, to do that, we need to affect engineering education. We need to affect the University of Toronto. We need to affect University of Toronto Mechanical Engineering Department. So how do you tip 25% of mechanical engineering at U of T as part of that nested tipping points over to tipping the whole community in Canada? To do that in general, we see working at 3 different levels. We have to affect individual behaviors. We need to feel more people individually exhibiting these behaviors, more organizations embedding TS in their culture, and then paradigm shifting at systems level in engineering education and consulting engineering. To do that, we have 3 main offerings. We're developing a technological stewardship platform, an org consulting offering, and continuing to do work at a systems level. The platform is basically this online hub that for people to come, all of these people that are feeling conflicted about their engineering career. It's like, I feel this pride, but I also have these misgivings and these questions, and there's no room in my career, in my day job to do that. And I wasn't trained to do this. And so this is a place for people to find each other who are struggling with that. And then a core functionality that we're developing within this is actually helping people build reflective practice. Just, hey, we hear you, we see you, we know this is hard. Maybe you care about climate change, you care about inclusivity, but you just don't see how to do it in your job. Hey, we know it's tough, we know it's hard. And so here's a place where you can figure that out together. And one of the things we're going to offer you is, as a starting point, is just like simple reflection, like 5 minutes a week over a coffee. Just start thinking about some of these questions and connecting to others. So this is a mock-up of a practice prompt that we're playing with for the functionality where, each week you get like a different principle and a different kind of deep dive question, and you can connect to other people around it. So we're building that habit of practice at an individual level. On the systems level, we've evolved our core lab, the Engineering Change Lab, from like an exploratory mode to establishing tech stewardship to now this next 10 years being much more about, all right, how do we get to the tipping point? How do we get to 100,000 people? And there's some specific sort of sub-systems level initiatives that we think are going to be really critical in this. Like we're looking at ways to deepen our work on Indigenous worldviews and technological stewardship, doing some learning circles that are elder-led to bring a whole new mindset to how we think about engineering and technology. And then, of course, engineering education reform is a big milestone that we're kind of putting extra effort on too. So the one I wanted to focus on the last few minutes, which is the one that's more specific here in today's topic and to your firms, is org consulting. So the Engineering Change Lab Canada doesn't want to offer this consulting ourselves. We want to support other firms to build a technological stewardship consulting offering into your businesses. And so that you can support your clients to achieve local 25% tipping points within their teams and companies. And so this will all connect, of course, to the technological stewardship platform. So you work with the company to get these practices internally, and then their internal community of practice can connect to others through the technological stewardship platform. So really, we're hoping over time that there will be a marketplace of several consulting firms that offer technological stewardship consulting to their clients. The one we started with is our new host. So Mars Discovery District is a big innovation hub in Canada. It's like, I don't know, $40 million a year budget. It's a physical space. It's a venture startup hub. And it also does consulting with around innovation with a wide range of companies. So the natural place was to skin technological stewardship into the current Mars offering. So this is us adapting technological stewardship into Mars branding for Mars clients so they can integrate it into their work. And this is something that we're looking to do with other firms too, like consulting engineering firms, management firms. And basically the way we're pitching this is, we all know technology has this potential to make the world a better place. How is tech innovation making things better for your tech innovation, making things better for the world, the org, your people? And what is your underlying tech innovation culture? What we've noticed in dealing with all of these organizations is there's a dominant tech paradigm that technology is neutral, mostly digital, creators of technology work in silos with this narrow belief in rationality. We recognize this emerging tech paradigm that sees tech development as value laden. The lines are blurring between physical, digital, biological, and we need to be much more intentional about shaping our tech to ensure it has positive impact. Move fast and break things is the slogan of the dangerous previous and still dominant narrative of innovation. So embracing the emerging technological stewardship paradigm, we use the term tech stewardship as behavior that integrate competing values to ensure technology is beneficial for all. And so this is the way we show up and as Engineering Change Lab as a partner, and then lends credibility and is kind of the backstory of how Mars pitches this. And so then we get into a little bit of how
a couple more minutes, Mark.
Yeah, just got 2 more and then I'll be, there's different ways to sell this in different contexts. Here we're talking about like for energy clients, which is one of the big Mars pieces, talking about how there's documented studies about how engineering and technology training lacks a focus on the skills for clean technology design and implementation. So we're making the argument specific to a sector and client here. More generically, if you're talking about sort of like employee retention and talent, we're referencing here some research by .Everyone, which is a UK nonprofit that talked about how over a quarter of tech workers have seen questions of technology they felt could have negative consequences for people or society, and nearly a fifth of them then leave as a result. And these are the people you most don't want to leave, the people that are passionate and want change and for the right reasons. And you know that behind those people that are leaving, there's a bunch of other people that are checking out without leaving. And so this is really about empowering like the best people in these organizations. And the offering that we're doing is basically a microcosm of the bigger Engineering Change Lab offering. We're supporting the consulting firms to support their clients to build internal communities of practice towards tipping points cultural tipping points within their company. So coaching them to focus on the innovators and early adopters that exist in their companies already and knit them together into community of practice. And so there's a lot of like deeper strategy on that about why that's a more effective way than trying to go broad in the beginning. So through the actual process, we help them identify those innovators and early adopters. We help them actually challenge some of their underlying paradigms. Like it's amazing, engineering firms, tech firms, companies that focus on innovation have typically never actually spent time talking about what those words mean or what their internal philosophy of innovation or engineering or technology is. As much as they understand those things to be critical, there isn't actually a robust understanding within the typical company of what these concepts even mean. So as we start to set foundations around that, we build that internal community practice connected to external community practice. And as we progress, we're institutionalizing, not just changing the culture, but institutionalizing these concepts and training key processes, their evaluation and strategy. And so there's kind of an overall patterning for this. I won't go into the details, but it's basically a cohort model where we find those innovators. We support the internal champions that are already like passionate about these things to build their internal community practice and get to the 25%. So the sort of wrap up of the pitch is that realizing the full promise of technological innovation. Just as decades ago, leading orgs realized that a strong health and safety culture was good for business and people, leading organizations today are investing in strong tech stewardship cultures that enable their people to innovate in a win-win-win manner that benefits the world, your business, and your team. And so this consulting offering is kind of like you offering your clients an opportunity to actually join this emerging paradigm, this community of practice. Yeah, so that's a glimpse. There's a lot more beneath all of this, but that's a glimpse of Engineering Change Lab Canada's, the stakes we put in the ground in terms of like the 10 years trying to get to this tipping point. And maybe just one last thing I'll say is like, a big thing underlying all of this is the recognition that there's so many great initiatives happening right now, but they're fragmented and disconnected. So a student will experience this amazing thing over here, and then they'll go back into the dominant stream of engineering and say, okay, that was an anomaly, and this is what engineering is. And the strategy here is to try to get over the hump where we're not always fighting that headwind, but these things, the things that are already existing can start to knit together and become the new dominant paradigm, and we start to create a tailwind instead of a headwind.
All right, thanks, Mark. I mean, it has been a joy to see the emergence of technological stewardship, via the efforts of the Engineering Change Lab Canada, and to really, in that evolution, see the potential. I think that Mark and his colleagues and the community up in Canada and in the US, I mean, it's been connected. The potential of that emergence. So thank you for that. I mean, there's huge things to learn there from Mark as well as from Doug on both sides of those things. So I will note, so those are the mindsets. And I think Mark's concept of tipping point probably plays for both of them. An entrepreneurial mindset, the tipping point that will come through programs like the Keen program, the Keen work in 50 academic institutions and growing. The tipping point that will come with technological stewardship as that spreads both in academia but also in practice. Create a shift with regard to who's in the workforce, what their values are, beliefs, how they go about their work. So that really was the context that we want to move to now, and that with a deeper exploration of that. And we've got two pieces of research that we want to share. The first is a general sense of what values mindsets are inside of these engineering companies, consulting engineering firms. And that will be represented by a piece of research that Mike McBeacon and I took on, which was just to provide a snapshot using, to be careful about this, a convenient sample. So this is not a statistically validated, set of data that we're going to present, but this is a convenient sample of firms that have been active participants with the Change Lab US. That convenient sample to look at through these focus groups, what are some of the general beliefs and values inside their workforce, both of that they have as personal beliefs and values, but also their sense of where their firms are at. And we wanted to have that sort of overarching view. And to do that, understanding that, those values and beliefs may be different depending on age and experience level inside those organizations, or at least test that. So we took focus groups that, would reflect those different age cohorts and conducted those really to get that general picture, but as well to provide a broader container for the more detailed work that's going to be presented by Darshan Karwat and his Arizona State team that looks at three specific values and really examines where they stand today with regard to the population inside these engineering companies, but also speculate about what that might look like into the future. So with the next slide, Mike, I can just give a quick note. For the focus group study that Mike and I did, we looked at 3 different age groups, 1 to 3 years, and actually a total of eight focus groups, around 55 participants, three groups that were comprised of 1 to 3 years, 3 groups that were in the 5 to 10 year category, and then one more senior group at the 20 to 25 year. They represented 12 firms. As I said, the firms are, firms, here, GMB, Degenkolb, Jose Guerra, CNS, Oltig, Lamper, Nearson, Mead and Hunt, Power Engineers, Robert Kistner, Panoni, Solfus, and Black and Veatch were all the firms that participated. In those firms, it was a nice mix of large to small. In terms of size of firms, it was also a mix in terms of single discipline versus multidiscipline, and different practice areas from that perspective. So in this convenient sample, I think it did have a good nature to it from that perspective. But as well, I think we have to recognize that these are firms that demonstrated a certain value set organizationally just by being participants with the Change Lab. So there might be some self-selection bias in the population that chooses to join and stay with these organizations. Focus groups used open-ended questions to do that. What we want to do is briefly go through the results of these open-ended questions and then come to some overall observations at the end, and then really save most of the time for coming to the more substantive work that Darshan and his team are going to present. So Mike, do you want to take, and Mike and I are going to flip back and forth on the 7 research questions that we use for the focus groups and give you a snapshot of those and then get to the conclusions. So Mike?
Yeah, so as we present these results, these slides will show the question asked at the top, a compilation of the comments in the graph by age cohort, and then below each graph, just a sample specific quote that illustrates the predominant themes that we heard. So the first 2 questions focused on what do the practicing engineers find as most inspirational about their work. And we asked them to speak generally about this topic, but also to highlight a specific event that epitomized their thoughts. So in the 1 to 3 year group, you see the dominant theme of the community impact of their work as being really a part of their inspiration, or the big part. But you also see things like accomplishing something through a project, which as they're new in their career is really meaningful. Also meaningful earlier in their career is contributing to a team. And then some of the specific things we heard, seeing the impact of my work, a new hospital, retrofit of a major bridge, a new bike lane program, commissioning of a new station. In the 5 to 10 year group, you again see community impact of work as the most common response. Also project accomplishment and several other things. We heard a quote of someone who questioned their career choice early on, but now sees the impact of their work in the community. Another quote of seeing the willingness of those in the industry to help others, that we should be proud to be nerds. And then in the older age cohort, again, that community impact, but also the more predominant theme of contributing to employee development. The quote of seeing the impact of design on people's lives, regardless of their status, and being inspired by the passion of those I learned from, and now having taken on that teaching role. So our overall conclusions on the first 2 questions is that community impact of work is important across all age cohorts. And the sense of contributing to a project or a team is really important to those early in their career. And increased emphasis on developing others in the older cohorts. And environmental stewardship showing up in all cohorts, but not the dominant inspiration for their work.
The second question, or it was question 3 on our list, we combined the first 2. Question 3 on our list really asked people to reflect upon trying to identify core values that they held personally as engineers. So this was trying to not go through the entire list of the values that they might bring to the table, but what did they consider the top 2 or 3 most significant personal values that they had? In in all groups across the cohorts, the emphasis was on integrity and honesty as the fundamental core value that all groups brought to the table. Reflected there, you can kind of see that that was core. But by the time we got to the 5 to 10 year core, and particularly into the 20 to 25 year cohort, that idea of community impact, but in this case we were phrasing it, making the world a better place, began to be quite important for people in that set of core values, along with integrity. Yeah, we want to have integrity and honesty. I believe in that, but I also believe as a fundamental piece of my core values in making the world a better place. I am very similar to the notion of the community impact that Mike had said. You want to go to the next slide, Mike? Just, as we look through that data, the other thing that we notice in these core values is that when you move into the 5 to 10 year cohort, suddenly the idea of work-life balance begins to be particularly significant as a core value. Probably no surprise in terms of what the age of these people are by the time they reach that 5 or 10 years of experience, but also due to, I suspect, the pressures that they're feeling on the job. These are the folks that are really running the projects now and feeling the pressure from the outside, the client organizations, other stakeholders around the projects, as well as the pressure inside to get the work done. So the combination of that really beginning to shift, where the 1 to 3 year, no real emphasis on work-life balance. By the time you get to 5 to 10 year, significant. Environmental stewardship, again, was noted by all, but was not expressed as a dominant core value. Mike?
Okay, so in question 4, we asked them to, again, even go deeper with the respect to the idea of core values and to talk about the essence of their work as an engineer or member of the engineering community. And here in the 1 to 3 year group, again, no surprise, community impact, the dominant response, quality, honesty, ethics, also important. And you see in the quotes that designing, recognizing the far-reaching impact of their work on society and into the future. In the 5 to 10 year cohort, community impact again, but also the notion of solving problems, hard problems, shows up as the essence of their work. And one person expressed it as socially responsible problem solving, and another as safeguarding the natural environment while building communities. In the 20 to 25 year group, again, community impact, provide and a few other things showing up, and you see providing valuable solutions for society, inspiring young talent, protecting public health, and restoring the environment. So conclusions, again, that importance of the community impact of their work, honesty, ethics, and quality, similar to what we asked them about in individual values, shows up again, particularly in the younger cohort, and problem solving as the essence of their work in the 5 to 10 year cohort.
For question 5, we wanted to move from personal values to organizational values, and their sense, again, of the core organizational values, not the full slate that might be present inside the organization, but what were the top 2 or 3? And here, consistently across the cohorts, the most emphasis was, or the most identified core value was centered on putting people first. And in putting people first, it was a broad sense of, really understanding pressures that people are feeling around work-life balance and addressing those, being family-oriented as an organization in terms of taking care of each other, a commitment to growing people, and in general, this sense of taking care of people. And that there was a recognition in the organizations that they were part of that there was a real emphasis on putting people first as this really dominant core value across the groups. Interestingly, a second core value began to emerge for the 5 to 10 to 20 to 25 cohorts. And that was that there began to be a more of an emphasis on giving back to the community. Now that wasn't the same as community impact in terms of doing work that impacts the community. This was more of an emphasis on what are the firms doing directly to give back to the community through community service, other types of activities in that regard. And then finally, in the 20 to 25, there was more of an emphasis on client relationships and service that showed up. Dominant thing though here, in this picture is putting people first, and then that sort of, for the older cohorts, the recognition of the importance of giving back to the community as core organizational values. Mike?
Okay, and the next question, we asked the participants to look ahead 10 years and tell us what their highest aspirations are for the firm that they're part of. In the 1 to 3 year group, pretty even responses there, but they're focused on reputation. They're also focused on innovation, using new technologies in appropriate ways. They're focused on environmental stewardship and want to be part of firms that invest in their development. In the 5 to 10 year cohort, again, we see that focus. They want to be a part of a firm that is investing in people and developing people. But you also see interest in reputation, similar to the younger cohort, innovation, similar. Also now advances in diversity and inclusivity and in long-term growth. And in the 20 to 25 year cohort, dominant, they want to be part of a firm that is investing in prioritizing people, and then a few others showing up as well. So our conclusions there, across all cohorts, they want to be part of firms that are investing in employees and investing in employee development. Reputation is also important across all cohorts. Innovation is an important element in those younger cohorts. Environmental stewardship is important in the younger cohort. Diversity and inclusivity is showing up. And unique to the older group, employee ownership showed up as an important aspiration for the future.
All right, the seventh question was in the form of a wish. And it really was to say, imagine, 10 years out is 2030. What wish would you make about the firm and what has contributed to the community or the world? And, as those wishes came in the different focus groups in the youngest 1 to 3 year cohort, the wishes centered again on wishing that their firms would really have, develop the capacity to put people first in that way that I described before, that care for the people inside the organization, developing them, as Mike just mentioned in the aspiration side. That was, a real emphasis for the youngest cohort. The 5 to 10 year cohort began to, really emphasize making the world a better place. And they began, consistently to bring up the issue of new approaches to profitability as a wish. They were feeling boxed in by the selling hours and by the pressure that they were feeling in, the commoditized world that many of these firms face, that they, the current approaches to profitability and the pressure around those inside the workplace. The wish was, I wish we find a way out of that box, new approaches that save us from that world. The oldest cohort's more about, embracing innovation as organizations, continuing to make the world a better place. And then, maintaining the culture while the organizations grow from that perspective. So the summary conclusions on the next page, Mike, really, this emphasis on putting people first. Increased diversity begins to show up a little bit in the wishes, but for the older generations, making the world a better place. But this emphasis, the 5 to 10 year cohort, really feeling about how to escape the pressures of the current profitability structure inside organizations. Now, overall, if we look at all those questions, some of our summary conclusions, making the world a better place, positively impacting community was a predominant theme. We think demonstrating the importance of purpose for these organizations. On the personal value side, the integrity and honesty is really the major flag that people have for themselves. I think it also shows up in the organizations, but also the pressure, the people needing to emphasize in their personal values, work-life balance, that it's not just about work. They've got values that allow the life family side to show up as well. On the organizational side, putting people first was of high importance. Aspirations and wishes, included, the emergence now, I think, of diversity, equity, inclusivity, environmental stewardship, and innovation for the younger cohorts in particular. And then when we asked people as a final coda, as we were wrapping up the sessions, about their perception of how aligned they were between, their personal values and these organizational values that they spoke of, almost to a person, it was really quite consistent that people felt that they were well aligned with their organizations, and didn't matter which of the cohorts that we were talking with at that point. So a lot of alignment. Now, that's a brief sort of look. Again, you'll have the opportunity, if you want to look at more of the data as expressed in those bar charts, et cetera, all of this will be available after the session. But what I want to do is
again, Kyle, just to add to that, if anybody is interested in really digging into it in more detail, I'd be glad to share just the notes, the compiled notes from each of the age cohorts, so you can see the comments that were made. I can make that available to anyone who's interested.
So as I said, we wanted to use that general focus group just to, give a sense, what are some of the, what's the field of play with regard to values, and, to seed a exploration that we're going to do in an exercise is what happens when those value sets mature for 10 years inside the organizations, making the world a better place, or the pressure, the values around work life, et cetera. How will those play out over the next 10 years? But we also really want to dive much deeper into 3 of the particularly important emerging values that we see in play. And that's the notion of social justice, environmental protection, and diversity and inclusion. And here, we were just absolutely, pleased that Darshan Karwat joined us in conducting a pilot study looking at how those values show up in these types of firms. And I'll let him sort of talk through that. Darshan is a assistant professor at Arizona State within their School for the Future of Innovation in Society in the Polytechnic School there. He had joined us for a previous summit with the Change Lab last summer, looking at reflective practices for engineers that get at some of the things that Mark Abbott was talking about in terms of his reflective questions that were showing up. Darshan will be joined by 2 of his colleagues that have been actively involved with the work, Eric Stribling and Madison Messias. And we have really appreciated the work that both Darshan, but his team, Eric, Maddie, and others have done with regard to putting together, conducting and then putting together their analysis of what the results were telling them. So with that, Darshan, I'll turn it over to you and your team.
Hey, everybody. Fabulous to see some familiar faces. Hello, and it's a pleasure to make your acquaintance if we haven't met yet. I just want to express my deep gratitude to ECL-USA for providing the space for these kinds of conversations and for bringing me back a few months after my first provocation. That conversation a few months ago led to some really, really interesting future conversations. which led to this current project. At Arizona State University, I run a lab called Re-Engineered. And the goal of this lab is to center ideas of environmental protection, social justice, peace, and human rights in engineering. And we are really interested in thinking about this not from a philosophical perspective all the way to a practical, hands-on orientation. Environmental challenges, of course, like climate change, social challenges like racial justice, have become much more salient in engineering circles, and I'm glad that that's actually the case. And a lot of that has come up in discussions today. And you know, broadly, what we know about engineers is that many people who come into engineering come into it because they feel like it's a way in which they can make a meaningful impact on the world. However, there is increasing research that is also showing that the way in which we train and acculturate engineers and the organizational context that we put them in actually decreases engineers' concerns for public welfare. Okay, so let that sink in for just a moment. And so, you know, it's been great to hear the remarks of Doug and Mark, because I think it sets up what we're about to present quite well. And, you know, one of the things that perhaps Doug will attest to is that a lot of what we know about engineers and engineering comes from studying students. There's actually very little rigorous study on what practicing engineers care about. And so part of what we want to do with this work is really shift the focus from, you know, of course, studying engineering students and their values and perspectives, and thinking about what it's like to actually be in the working world and the extent to which the working world allows for engineers to express their values and work on the concerns that they care about. And so, as I mentioned, you know, we care about issues of environmental protection and social justice. And in talking to Mike and Kyle, questions related to diversity, equity, and inclusion were important to them. And so that's something that we incorporated into what you're about to hear. So this research that we're going to present is exploratory in nature. Kyle mentioned the word pilot study, and it is absolutely that. And so, you know, a few things to bear in mind as you hear what we're going to share. The first is that there are way more data and analyses that we have done from the data that we've gathered that we're going to then we're presenting to you. So there's a lot that we've done that we're not sharing. And if you have questions about that, we'd be happy to continue the conversation with you. In the spirit of provocation, as you're listening to Eric and Maddie, think about what is interesting to you in what you're hearing. What questions come to mind? What do you think we might be able to do with the kind of information that you're hearing? Okay, and I want to emphasize again that since this is a pilot, there's plenty of potential for modification or building off of the work that we've done, or maybe adding more to it, thinking about new kinds of questions that perhaps provide the insights that we are seeking to address some of the key questions around what the firm of the future might be, the extent to which the values of firms and the values of engineers may or may not align, and what that means for engineering. You know, in the end, because I and we are engineers, we want to do things in the world. And so the point of doing this research is so that we can do something with it. So if you have ideas, please share that with us, because in the end, we really care about thinking about environmental justice, environmental protection, social justice, and so on, very seamless in engineering work. We want it to be part and parcel of what engineering is all about. So with that, I just want to express my deep gratitude to ECL-USA for strategic guidance and funding support here. Kyle, of course, for his constant provocations. There are a couple other folks who haven't been able to join this conversation. Adam Carberry and David Douglas have been two of the advisors for the work that we've done. And I also want to thank all of you who helped share this work, getting the word about the survey out, participating in the focus group, and really just sharing your time with us. We're very, very grateful for that. So with that, I'll hand it over to Eric, who is a PhD student in innovations and global development in the School for the Future of Innovation Society, and Maddie Macias, who just graduated with her undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering and is going to be joining the urban planning program at Arizona State University.
Okay, thank you, Darshan. Let me just share my screen. All right. My name is Eric Stribling. I'm a researcher with Reengineered, and this project what we did with Jean Boucher, Maddie Macias, and Darshan, with some advice from Adam Carberry, David Douglas, Kyle Davey, and Mike. And we're gonna, in this study, we're gonna specifically look into the question, will the values of the firms of the future line up with the values of the engineer of the future? And so we have one big primary research goal with this study, and that's sort of to look into what degree do future engineers' environmental and social values align with those of their firms. So sort of thinking, 10, 20 years into the future. And in order to answer that question, we divided this up into two primary sub questions, which are, what are the environmental and social values of engineers now? And then how do those values of the younger cohort compare with those of their firms and also with their older engineers? So in brief, we conducted an online survey where we had 365 respondents from across a large number of companies who participate in ECL-USA. And then we followed this up by 3 focus groups. So after we got a large amount of responses from engineers about their values, we wanted to dig deeper and sort of understand what the data could mean. And so we sort of took those findings and helped, those findings sort of crafted our questions that we then presented to our 3 focus groups. And we had 8 total engineers participate across those groups. And out of this research process, we had 3 main takeaways. The first one is that of the 3 values that we looked into, environmental values, social justice values, and diversity in the workplace, environmental values came out as the strongest. And this was also the area where engineers felt that their firms did not line up with their own values. The second takeaway was that overall, cultural attitudes towards environmental and social values in the United States have shifted, and they've shifted relatively quickly. And we're starting to see that in engineers' day-to-day work life, these values are changing the way that they're doing work. And then finally, the third takeaway is that we saw particularly young and politically liberal engineers appear more motivated to push for changes in their workplace to reflect their values. And we've actually had comments from especially some of the focus groups that employers have been feeling some pressure to make accommodations to these values in order to retain their talent. So in this presentation, we're first going to present our framework and our methodology. And then I'm going to pass it over to Maddie to talk about some key demographic traits of our respondent group. And then I'll come back and I'll address our 3 primary research findings. And then we'll finish off with a conclusion. We'll have some opportunity for questions. And then I have some discussion points for the discussion that I believe is following this presentation. So first off right here, I'd like to look at our research framework and our methods. So we looked at three primary values: environmental protection, which sort of encompasses sustainability, biodiversity, and response to climate change. We looked at social justice, which is a bit broad. It can sort of encompass everything from human rights and well-being to the impact of technology on society. But there's a very specific aspect of social justice that has received a lot of attention in engineering, and that is diversity in the workplace, specifically equal representation of women and minority groups within the field of engineering. And now, another framework that we used, when we talk about someone's values, what do we really mean? And from the world of sociology, you can there's an idea that values stem out of someone's identity, how they think about themselves and what that means. And so we're using a multiple identity framework, which we've seen as very valuable for this question. And this sort of posits that everyone has several identities coming from different groups that they're a part of. So everyone has sort of a personal identity that may be their own views, but there's also sort of a social identity that comes from the workplace, from being a group member in particularly a firm. And then there's also an identity, a professional identity that comes from just being an engineer and what that means for someone. And all three of those identities sort of come together and compete to form someone's total individual identity. And so we use these three values and these three understandings of identity to sort of create a variety of questions that sort of tackle value and what that means for someone and what that means for firms and the world. And we created 27 value questions. And then we asked 16 different demographic questions. And as I said previously, we got 365 respondents, and that's enough respondents to where we can start to look at some of these demographics and ask questions about what different groups feel their values are, and we can sort of produce some statistically significant results from that combination. And then, as I said previously, then we followed up with some focus groups to really get at what the meaning behind the data was. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Maddie, who's going to give us an overview of who our respondents were.
Thank you, Eric. So the first demographic that we looked at was our age distribution among the 365 respondents. And to preface this, we categorize engineers under 45 years old as younger engineers and engineers over 45 as older engineers. So you can see kind of by this distribution that the majority was younger engineers at around 63%, and then older engineers made just about 37%. And also, notably, the two age ranges with the largest number of responses was ages 25 to 34 and ages 35 to 44. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then here we can see the race distribution of our sample. Notably, that a majority of our responses were white, coming in at around 78%. And then we also see that a majority is male, making up about 67%. But something interesting is that among the younger engineers that you can see down here in the bottom left corner is that we do see more of representation of more diverse engineers, and then we also see a greater representation of women engineers. Another interesting demographic that we looked at was political orientation of our sample, and hopefully somewhat intuitively, this was categorized where the dark red is very conservative, the lighter red is somewhat conservative, our moderates are in that gray color, somewhat liberal is in that light blue color, and then very liberal is in that dark blue color. And as you can observe here, we have a majority of our respondents being either somewhat liberal or moderate. And then notably, we have these kind of extreme sides of the political spectrum making up the smaller majorities. So most of the majority fall somewhere in the middle of the political spectrum. And then here we can kind of see that distribution again and how it relates to the age ranges. So notably that the younger engineers tend to be more liberal and older engineers tend to be more conservative. And you can see that happening right at that kind of 45 to 54 cutoff, where we see that red area of this chart kind of increase and the blue areas start to decrease. And then the inverse is also true for younger engineers. And with that, I will hand it back to Eric.
Thanks, Maddie. So now I'm going to sort of look at our results, and I'm dividing that up into three parts. The first part I'm going to look at is the question asking what are our respondents' personal values and how do those values align with those of their firm. So when we look at when we look at first a comparison of very similar questions addressing the three values specifically, environment, social justice, and diversity, we find that environmental values come out slightly stronger than the other two. Our questions used a 7-point Likert scale ranging from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And so a numeric value was then added to those such that strongly disagree was a 1 and strongly agree was a 7. So as you can see, whereas environmental protection comes in at somewhere between agree and strongly agree, social justice, which was our lowest rated, comes in somewhere between slightly agree and agree. So that's what these numbers mean. All right, we also looked at focus group comments on individuals' values, and we find that, you know, environmental values and social values tend to be both personally valued and to be considered good business practice. However, the term social justice tends to have slight political overtones. And while the idea is valued, sometimes, as this correspondent here at the lower right says, it has a bit of a bristly effect on some employees. Here, I want to actually take a little bit of a side note and talk about diversity in the workplace specifically. When you start to really get into the meat of diversity in the workplace, diversity is a strong value regardless of where you end up on the political spectrum. Here I've put a very conservative engineer's opinions next to a very liberal engineer's opinions. And what you see is both sides consider diversity in the workplace to be very important. And the conversation about diversity in the workplace is usually framed within an appeal to the rigor of engineering. So while on the conservative side, this respondent said that he wants to hire people based on their technical abilities and not look at the color of their skin. On the liberal side, you see the respondent saying, I've never, as a Black female engineer, I've never worked alongside another Black female engineer. And I think that minorities are being excluded from engineering at a middle school level. So, this is a bit of a tangent, but I think this really enriches our understanding of engineers' views on diversity. So now when we transition from personal values to how those align with those of the firms, I'm presenting here environmental values and the firm and whether those align, because this was our survey result with the lowest amount of agreement. So if we look a little bit closer here at the histogram on the left, we see the mean being 5, which corresponds with slightly agree, which you can see with the apex of this curve. And then on the right-hand side, I'm showing the statistically significant demographic effects, which show that if you are younger than 45 or female, there's a tendency for an influence on that mean. And this is coming from the multivariate linear regression coefficients. And I'm only listing ones that we found are significant at least the 90% percentile. When we bring these questions back to the focus groups, we do see a lot of comments on younger engineers coming into the workplace with stronger environmental and social values that they want to make a bit of a change in the workplace. So on the left-hand side, you see that they're coming in wanting to make a difference in the world from, you know, the job is not just a job that makes money. That there's a sense of purpose attached to younger engineers coming in and seeing their jobs. And at the same time, you see correspondents observing more especially environmental values. So some takeaway thoughts from this first section are that there is wide agreement on environmental, social, and DEI values. And there's a strong aspiration for firms to be more concerned about environmental impacts, whereas in social justice and DEI, firms are largely seen as aligning with personal values. Now I'm going to move on to day-to-day work and how these values intersect. So what we see here, we've asked, does the ability to assess environmental implications of engineering designs, is that a useful skill for me in my work? And we see here that there's pretty much large agreement with a slight political effect. And then the focus group comments, we start to see that there's a difference on engineering disciplines. Engineering disciplines, especially when it comes to environmental values, they have different experiences. So on the left-hand side, we see mechanical engineers being impacted negatively by environmental changes in building codes. Whereas on the right-hand side, we see an environmental engineer saying, oh, the way that outsiders see my job has significantly changed in 40 years. And we start to see this also coming out in the data. So here, we ask whether environmental regulations cause unnecessary costs. And while we do see a political effect, when we take those politics out, civil engineers stand out as agreeing with this statement that environmental regulations cause unnecessary costs to their projects specifically. And very similarly here, the services my firm provides contribute to environmental problems. Environmental engineers are strongly disagreeing, whereas mechanical engineers, whose jobs may involve, for example, the combustion of fossil fuels, stand out in the opposite direction, agreeing with this statement. When we move into the focus groups, we start to see that social values are tending to have an impact on people's jobs. So, you know, on the left-hand side, we have someone drawing a civil engineer drawing a map and having the neighborhood social justice committee tell them that this map with this color gradient is racist. And they had to then change the color gradients to something that did not flow logically, that the colors did not adhere to a scale. And on the right-hand side, we see a push in civil engineering towards a more participatory design approach where numerous stakeholders were sought out more than had been in the past. And then in the data, we see the same, we see sort of the same change. Here we're asking, does social justice, is that inside of what you consider engineering work? And on the whole, there is disagreement that it is outside. So most engineers are seeing that the ability to assess social implications on in their work is important. So as we close out this section, some of the takeaways I think that we can glean is that engineering work is being strongly affected by environmental and social concerns, and that this is changing the way that people do their work, and how their experience, how their day-to-day experience is with these values also informs their personal values. And so as I move into the last section, we're really in this section trying to ask, do these values produce change? And this is a really hard question to ask, but we pull sort of an insight from sociology, where you can ask someone if they're willing to pay, if they're willing to give money to make a change, and that sort of is used by as a proxy for understanding whether someone's values are strong enough to where they want to make a change in their environment. So we asked across all of these values whether someone would be willing to accept a lower paying job for the opportunity to work on some of these values. And we find most of our results, this is environmental, falling along political lines. Here you see very conservative pulling strongly towards the disagree, I would not take a new job, and very liberal pulling strong towards the agree side, where I would be willing to take a lower paying job. And we see similar findings as we, across all values. So here's social justice and whether or not you would want to change jobs. And you're seeing very conservative pulling one way, very liberal pulling the other way. Really interesting here is that age is not significant. And you would expect younger engineers to be a little bit more fluid in their jobs. They don't have as much experience. Perhaps they've realized that there's something else they want to do with their lives, but this is not found to be a significant indicator. And it's even older engineers who may be feeling the desire to make significant changes. Also a diverse workplace, we find the same pull. And this, if you think about it, I would be willing to accept a lower paying job. It's not a small amount of, on all three of these sections, it's not a small amount of engineers. We do see a smaller amount of engineers on this next question, which is much more aggressive in its statement. And that's, as soon as I find a job with more social impact, I will leave engineering. And while we most engineers are happy to be engineers, there is, and this falls along liberal political values, that to me, I think that this finding may suggest that there is some people who identify as politically liberal may find that the field of engineering is not fulfilling, for them. When we try and get at this in the focus groups, there is a limitation that you can't ask current engineers about dropping out, because they are still here. They have not dropped out. But we do see evidence that there is a lot of change happening in companies towards these two values. And one thing that we didn't really study, but that popped out, is that there's also a significant push towards quality of life or home life balance values that are also changing the workplace. So some takeaway thoughts here. Engineering companies are being pushed by their employees to make environmental, social, and quality of life changes. And then at least one respondent stated that these changes were made to retain employees. Liberals especially may be motivated to push value-influenced changes in their workplace, or even change jobs for reasons of value. And then there's really, I think, a need here to look deeper into quality of life or work-life balance in future research. So as we conclude, just to sort of summarize, environmental values come out strongest, and this is also where engineers feel their firms don't line up with their expectations. diversity in the workplace. It might be more interesting to dig deeper into this, but there's a strong association with this issue and the rigor of engineering work and the engineering workplace. Broader cultural attitudes towards environmental and social values are changing, and this is also changing how engineers do their job. And finally, young and liberal engineers seem more motivated to push for changes in their workplace to reflect their values. And this possibly has implications for retention. So with that, I will close. I'll open it up now to any questions that people may have. And then following this, I do have a couple of discussion prompts.
Let me, Eric, we can field just one or two questions, and then rather than going into discussion at that point, I'm going to move into the exercise that we've set up in terms of doing that, just managing the time. So opening it up to everyone, one or two questions at this time, recognizing that it's a massive amount of data and insight that the team has brought forward here. But and here, just anyone who wants to chime in. I think, Eric, at this time, if you could end your screen share, that probably would be okay.
Sorry about that. Great.
This is David, and this might be for Darshan also. Mentioning the change in students that sometimes they kind of regress when they're actually in engineering school, and I want, and this is maybe an elephant in the room, a significant percentage of engineering faculty members come from outside the United States, and do they bring their values to the classroom that kind of may be different than faculty members from other disciplines?
That's a great question. I don't have an answer to that.
Okay.
I don't know. And I haven't heard of a study that focuses on that. Perhaps Doug might have some insights there.
I visit a lot of universities, a lot of departments, have a lot of meetings, and certainly engineering is a very diverse, maybe still predominantly male in faculty, but yeah, there's you do get a lot of international, there's a lot of international representation. I've been aware in my career of some biases that have come with from external cultures, just like they have internal cultures here in the U.S. I don't, David, I think I echo what Darshan says. I don't know of any studies. I think it would take a study to take a look at that. I do think when I, consider, I've got a data point. It's not a great data point, but I look at the makeup of the people that love to participate in the stuff that we're doing. Who participates in this key network? Who contributes to it? Well, I will tell you that we have a fellowship program, and of the 29 fellows that were awarded, people that really invested themselves in these ideas, it was predominantly women. I mean, more than and then also the ethnic diversity is pretty strong. It's, but somewhat representative still of the makeup of the faculty, of course. But I would say there is something that's attractive to some of the new ideas that is mixing mixing the balance from what might be traditional. And I think that's a positive. So I imagine Mark has seen some of that too.
Okay, I want to just move quickly. Just one more quick question, and then I want to move to our exercise, which really is an opportunity for the small groups to digest the perspectives that have been shared by Doug and Mark and Darshan, Eric and Maddie here. So anybody with one additional short question?
Yeah, Mark, you had your hand up.
I'm not sure if mine's short, so okay, well, I'll try and keep it short.
Well, offer it and then we'll see.
Yeah, I'll keep it short. Amazing work, and I think like the value lens is such a powerful one for engaging. I'm curious about this, this going back to what I was sharing earlier, this sense of like the underlying beliefs of what engineering is. And I threw into the chat this article about the myth of rationality in engineering. And one of the quotes you shared made me think of it because it reminded me of the article of people who were arguing against diversity because, well, engineering is a rational field. So we don't, they had a whole reason for not needing diversity. So I'm curious what you saw in terms of how people were interacting with values based on whether or not they understood engineering to be a value sensitive field, or sort of laboring under the myth of rationality. If there was kind of like because I guess my hypothesis is people would interact with this very differently based on their understanding of the nature of engineering.
I can take this. I think historically, engineering has been viewed as, and technology in general has been viewed as sort of value neutral. It's just a tool, right? It's whoever uses the tool. That's what creates the value. And I think more and more we're seeing a disagreement with that premise. And we're seeing a lot of changes in the design tools being used for engineering in response to that. Darshan, you want to add anything?
Nope. In the interest of time, we can save that discussion for a little bit later.
Okay. So again, much appreciate the work that Darshan and his team put in on this. And we're really looking forward to see how this gets taken forward from beyond the pilot study to looking, more fully within the population of consulting engineering or engineering companies, but also more fully across the engineering community, so that we begin to have, that sense of, good longevity or longitudinal values, of engineers in practice that is rich enough to really begin to help guide the future for these practices, for the engineering community. So what I want to do is give people a chance to think about what happens in the future for the firms, engineering companies, as people with these value sets, both current strong values but emerging values or an emerging mindsets, whether it's technological stewardship and entrepreneurship, or emerging or strengthening values with regard to social justice, environmental protection, diversity, et cetera, as those people move through their careers inside these firms for the next decade or longer. What are the implications of that? What might be the impacts of that for the organizations? So we want to put you into small groups. Once again, you'll find in the workbook, the Google Doc, there's a placeholder for each of the small groups, and that with regard to those, there's kind of two halves to the inquiry that we'd like you to do. One is a little bit of personal reflection, and you can pick. You don't have to do all 5 of these in terms of entrepreneurial mindset, technological stewardship, and the other 3 that Darshan's team looked at. Just pick 1 or 2 and sort of reflect, what are those implications? How do you personally relate to them? And then the second is, what do you think will happen inside the firms? We've got enough time for about 30 minutes in small groups. Then we'll come back and have some brief observations that people will have made in their small groups. But we want to give you some window of time to do that reflection. Once again, hopefully choose people to be the discussion leader, but also the recorder in the Google book or the Google Doc. To the extent we don't have time to report out everything, what you put in that Google Doc reflecting your discussion will be very useful for Mike and I, again, sort of putting the report together. We'll look forward to, what you've got to say. So 30 minutes, Mike, I think, can you still adjust the number of groups?
Yes.
Given the number of participants here, let's go down to 5 groups.
All right, hang on 1 second. Okay, here we go.
So that sense of, the importance of trying to really understand what are these value sets How do they differ across age cohorts? How that might affect the future of firms as those different cohorts age. How do you attract, retain, motivate people, from that perspective, I think is going to be central. So thank you for that exploration. Thanks for, the great work in terms of Darshan's team and Doug and Mark in terms of your presentations. Thanks as well from my perspective to the earlier presentations today with regard to those, looking at, how the landscape for firms is changing and the opportunities that come with that for new value propositions. So really appreciate great provocations and the good work in terms of the small group effort. Mike and I will be able to sort of harvest, I suspect, lots of good stuff out of your Google Docs. I will note about that, if there's things that you want to add to those Google Docs that are still important points that you didn't have time for, it's still available for you to do it. So, take advantage of that. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike for just some closing comments as we make our way out of here. So thanks, everyone.
Okay, Kyle. Well, thanks again for leading us through the discussion. And just to wrap up, thank you all for your contributions today, especially for hanging around for the entire summit. Appreciate that very much. It's tough to do in the Zoom world. So you will be receiving a post-summit survey, and we'd appreciate your feedback through that survey. Here are our upcoming programs. In the interest of continuing the conversation, we will have another virtual open house on July 27th. You can look for an email from me for more details coming soon. In October, we will return to in-person summits with the second edition of the Engineering Ideas Institute. The Institute will be held in Boulder, Colorado at a facility called the Colorado Chautauqua. It's a historic venue located right at the foot of the mountains. And there is on-site housing available, but it's limited. So if you're interested in an early reservation, please contact me. Our concept for the Engineering Ideas Institute that we developed right before the pandemic was to offer an extended 3-day event that is conducive to the deep dive learning that we seek and to focus on some of the most complex issues related to the future of engineering. So we're working to finalize our programming for Engineering Ideas Institute around 2 major themes. The first of those is engineering in an age of acceleration. Looking at what forces are accelerating in today's world: technology, natural environment, changes in society. What is our capacity to adapt to those accelerating forces? How can the engineering community play a role in helping society to adapt? And we will look at case studies that demonstrate the role of the engineering community in this type of world. The second theme will be engineering and racial inequality. And we will look to learn from history with respect to the practice of engineering and racial inequality. And we will look at what we can do through our work to create more diverse and equitable communities. And again, we'll look for case studies that demonstrate adaptations in engineering practice that are addressing racial inequality. And we would welcome your participation in both of these events. So through our work, we will continue to explore the important questions about the future of engineering. Our role is to be a change agent and prepare more engineers and more engineering organizations to look to the future. We hope you will stay engaged in our work. If you are aware of other organizations or individuals that should be engaged or should you think would enjoy being engaged in our work, please reach out to me. We're very close to hitting 500 stakeholders. Really want to keep that growth going. So thanks again for all of your participation today, and enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you, everybody.